Okay, it says that I am live, so the people in the chat who can verify you can one hear me and two it's coming out clearly. Let me know before I proceed. So test 1 2 1 2. But it says seven people are actually watching at the moment, and hopefully more will actually come in. I hope to have Stephen Smoot on in 60 minutes, and maybe Sarah Allen, Alan Hansen, even Blake Ostler will be joining me. And maybe sometime next week, Jacob Hansen. And you may be wondering why. This morning, 9 to 11 Mountain Standard Time, there was a debate on Pints with Aquinas, which hosted by Matt Frad, I was about to call him something else, Matt Frad, between Catholic apologist Trent Horn and my friend and fellow LDS apologist Jacob Hansen of Thoughtful Faith. So let me just see this. Well, I can hear myself on YouTube, so it's coming out clearly, even with my odd, weird Irish accent. So yeah, the debate was interesting. I'll give you some background. Back in April, Jacob was in Utah, and in the morning, he met with Blake Ostler, who's a very good friend of mine as well, going through his opening statement. Later that day, I think it was a Friday, we had lunch, also met for the first time, and he went through his opening statement with me as well. It was more or less like what he presented as part of his opening statement today, so I'm glad he didn't do a radical shift between April and today. I'm not a fan of the fruit argument, but overall, I think Jacob did as good a job as possible in 15 minutes in the lion's den. People are wondering where you can find this debate. I actually linked to it in the show notes. It's also on the Pints with Aquinas channel. Overall, Jacob did fine. I would give him, like, say, a B minus if I were to grade it. He did not answer some issues, which I think he should have answered. I'm not a fan of the fruit argument, but he did show that Trent Horn is full of, and I've been told not to curse on this stream, excrement when it comes to Mormonism. Trent is a very smart guy. He's very good at pro-life stuff. He's a good Catholic apologist, but he is absolute excrement when it comes to Mormonism. And Trent, if you listen to this, and you probably will, where the hell do you actually coming up with this absolute BS? You're not going to convince Latter-day Saints like myself who have actually read a book. I'll be perfectly blunt. And I think that was the assessment of Blake Ostler, who Horn has pretended to read as well. So okay, sorry, just responding to Stephen Smoot. He's in two minds about either coming on now or coming on later. So what I'm going to do is I will not do like a full review because that would take forever. And also Trent kind of raised issues that are not relevant to Book of Mormon authenticity, like Joseph Smith's plural marriages. On that seed, Don Bradley and Brian Hales. For instance, when it came to Oliver Cowdery and Fanny Alger, and by the way, Cowdery originally said it was a dirty, filthy scrape, not dirty, filthy affair. So kind of indicate these kind of indications Trent has not actually kept up on anything in the last few decades. He's basic MO is Google and whatever that intellectual fraud Jimmy Aiken regurgitates. So that's basically his MO. But Don Bradley and Christopher Smith, who's a Pentecostal, well, atheist now, former Pentecostal critic of the church, he's kind of cool towards the church now. In the recent series of essays by Signature Books, actually has a groundbreaking essay on Fanny Alger, how originally it was an adoptive sealing, and a host of other issues as well. It was never an adulterous affair. And also that the sealing took place after April of 1836. And for those who are familiar with Latter-day Saint history, that's significant. And for Trent Horn, that's when the keys were restored by Elijah in the Kirtland Temple. So there's a lot of things he's grossly ignorant on. He's reliant upon Todd Compton to some extent. And as much as I like Todd on a personal level, as with any Irishman, he talks your ear off. He served his mission in Ireland. His stuff is dated. Anything on polygamy since 2013 is super dated. And we have a special guest who's just joined us, Harry Smoot. Hi, Stephen.
Hello, Robert.
I just started the, so you didn't really miss out much. I just gave a background to the debate. What is your general assessment of the debate, and why do you think Trent Horn is full of crap?
Maybe you and I should have a debate on the debate. Have like a meta debate or a para debate, right? Yeah, that sounds like that'd be fun. No, so I knew about this debate because Jacob told me about it, and we kind of talked and strategized a little bit. So and I've watched Trent Horn I've watched his channel, plenty of times, so I kind of had a sense for what to expect. Overall, I think it's about what I expected for the caliber of like the people involved in the debate, right? And so these sorts of YouTube debates where it's like a big shot YouTuber personality type deal who are amateurs, and not in the derogatory sense are they amateurs, but amateurs in the sense of they're just like big YouTube personalities kind of just representing their positions. I thought coming in with that expectation, knowing who these guys were, I thought the debate overall was what I expected it to be, which was nothing really new or exciting was brought up in the debate, right? There were no new arguments that were hashed out. I will say kudos though to Trent Horn for trying out the dimensions of the plates don't work argument, because that one doesn't come up too often. By the way, I should apologize because my mouth is numb from the dentist. So if I sound like an idiot, well, it's because I'm an idiot, but also because my mouth is numb. So I apologize in advance. I should have said that. Yeah, I thought that his whole thing about, well, the dimensions of the plates don't work and you'd only have so many characters on the plates and so many English words. Like that sometimes gets brought up by people, but not super often. So it was kind of interesting that he brought it up. Not that it hasn't been dealt with ably before.
No, I mean, like,
not that there's
yeah,
funny
yeah,
stuff on it, but like, hey, props for originality on that point. And
yeah.
that in the list of arguments of the Gish Gallop arguments he brought up that are brought up all the time, that one tends to list pretty low, right? So that was
Yeah,
kind of
you're right. It was an absolute gish gallop, and like on the dimensions of the plates, like Yanni Sodal over like a century ago, kind of showed that it's a bollocks argument. And like most recently, Neil Rapley has done excellent work on how many characters could be fit on these ancient plates that have been discovered, transposing that to a Book of Mormon context. Same with Jerry Grover. We can't go into detail, but there's a secret project someone's working on as well when it comes to the plates. I mean,
yeah, this is an area of ongoing research, right?
Yeah,
and,
but
yeah.
I did tell like Jacob in advance, like Trent Horn would do the plates argument because he has mentioned in the past, like obliquely, like the golden plates is like a huge problem for the Book of Mormon. So,
oh, is that right? Oh, see,
yes,
I know he has a book out through or like an online
Catholic
book or
Answers
something
in
through Catholic
2015.
Answers.
Yeah, to be fair, he hasn't really expanded the punish. The
Yeah,
arguments
so
in
I
that book is
knowing what
basically
he
view
had
of the
said,
Hebrews and stuff like that.
yeah, knowing what he says in that book, I kind of expected, and some of that came up. View of the Hebrews came up. Lots of what the witnesses came up, right? But hey, so anyways, so yeah, props for originality on that point, I guess. Let's see, what else did I think? I'll let you go through because I'm sure that you've got some slides or other stuff you want to talk through. But like,
Yeah,
it was
I do have
disappointing
slides,
that.
but like you can jump in if you want. So,
Okay, yeah, I was just gonna say it was disappointing that he had like there were like three or four things he kept bringing up. Like he brought up like four to different times the signature of the witnesses aren't on the manuscript, or he kept misquoting David Whitmer, that one quote about separating himself from the saints. I'm sure you'll talk about those. So
oh, for frig's
I
sake,
mean,
yeah.
it was a little disappointing that, for such a high caliber good debater he usually is, he really stooped low to some of these points of attack that I just don't think really work very well. But we'll see what you have in your slides, and yeah, I'll jump in here or there and give some commentary perhaps.
Yeah, that's well, I can't see you while I share the slides. So like if you want to like jump in, let me know. But
Okay, yeah, we'll do.
yeah, so okay, I'm not gonna be covering everything, and if you want to like jump in and add anything, let me know. But yeah, this is the review of the Hansen Horn debate. First of all, I'm not really a fan of like how it was framed, like is the Book of Mormon divinely inspired? If it was me, it should be like, is the Book of Mormon historical? Because divine inspiration is kind of more of an ishy, oblique one. Like you could even argue the Book of Mormon is historical, but because it contains false theology from your Catholic perspective, it doesn't matter if it's 19th century or ancient, you can still reject it. So overall assessments, we already kind of covered that. I think Horn kind of embarrassed himself because he doesn't know what a hyperchoristic form of a name is, and we'll address it when we kind of get to Mulek. But myself and Smoot work for the B.H. Roberts Foundation, so definitely check out mormonor.org for Book of Mormon related research, like the huge anachronisms in the Book of Mormon series. I did tell Jacob to be ready for this, and it doesn't seem like Trent Horn is actually familiar with this kind of research, in spite of his claims to have, like, say, Red Fair or Blake Ostler and others as well. So, and also one of the arguments is like there's no evidence of Hebrew or Egyptian in ancient America, but Brian Stubbs, who's like one of only a few people who actually know Semitic languages and Uto-Aztecan languages, has actually shown that's not the case. There is evidence of Semitic Egyptian influence in these languages, which kind of covers like Mexico and parts of what is now the USA. And you can see this in his book, Exploring the Explanatory Power of Semitic and Egyptian in Uto-Aztecan. The first edition was in 2015, second in 2023, and it's actually on Jerry Grover's website. You can see the link here. So there's a number of things. One of the arguments, and Trent always brings this up a lot, is like, well, the Book of Mormon is in King James verbiage.
That drove me nuts. That was one of them.
It's a friggin' translation.
Well, what's funny is that's an argument that like Richard Dawkins tried to make back in the day, back when he met up with Brandon Flowers on that Swedish TV show, and he says a couple of times, he said, it's written in this Jacobean King James English, and people didn't speak like that in the 19th century, right? I'm like, yeah, what's your point, dude? Like, this is a well-studied phenomenon, pseudo-biblicism, the idea of like authors imitating the English of the King James Bible, the early modern English of the King James Bible. That's like a well-documented phenomenon where people do this kind of thing. They deliberately archaicize their language. So that was one of those few things. Sorry to interrupt, Robert, but that was one of the few things that he brought it up, I think, at least twice. And I'm like, dude, what's your point with this? Because it's so dumb. People are allowed to imitate earlier stages of their language. Even we do it today. Christians around the world, Latter-day Saints included, when we give prayers, we use these archaic pronouns. We switch to this register of like archaic English when we are giving formal public prayers in a ecclesiastical setting, because it's like code switching almost, where you enter into this language of reverence, this language of the divine, whatever. So yeah, that was one of those things I was like, man, that's so dumb. And it's dumb that both Christians and atheists alike bring up this point. As if Joseph Smith's not allowed, as a translator's not allowed to do this. My dude, I know translators of the Dead Sea Scrolls as late as the 1950s and 60s were giving it an archaic flavor with archaic pronouns and ETH ending verbs and things like that, right?
If you see the screen here, like this is from Trent and Roper's review of the New Mormon Challenge, a book I know Trent has read. They kind of know correctly, like Robert H. Charles in the Apocryphal Pseudepigrapha of the Old Testament follows King James verbiage, and how there was a Jewish scholar, Gaster, who intermingled KJV language and modern English in these Dead Sea scriptures, a translation of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there was even like a Gospel of Mark that was originally in modern Hebrew, but it was changed to like a more biblical sounding Hebrew because that was the language of the time. And I think also the late war, which has been making the rounds on like the anti-Mormons sphere, in recent years, kind of follows like, say, this kind of biblical King James like language as well. So it's very common in texts that at least purport to be translations of scripture and texts that are translations of scripture to follow more archaic forms of English. This is well documented, so.
And for what it's worth, this is a practice that stretches into antiquity. So, like in my area of expertise, Egyptian, I can tell you that centuries after Middle Egyptian was the spoken street Egyptian of commoners, it took on the flair like it was the literary language, and people are imitating it later, centuries later. Egyptians are still imitating Middle Egyptian, like classical Golden Age Egyptian, in their literary productions. It seems for the same reason that, right, this is you adapt archaicizing elements or features for literature that you want to in some way elevate, right, in terms of its the literary flair that it kind of gives or whatever. So the Babylonians did this too. Neo-Babylonians, they use archaic Old Babylonian in their literary inscriptions at times. So the Egyptians or the Babylonians are doing it. Even there's some who've argued that the Dead Sea Scrolls authors are using archaic forms of biblical Hebrew in some places, as opposed to the Hebrew being spoken in the first century BC. But for some reason, I guess Joseph Smith's not allowed to do it. Okay, right. Like that's one of those things where I just think, like, if you know anything about how languages work and people use archaic language, it's not a problem for the Book of Mormon.
I also have to wonder if Horn knows more than one language, but like we should write a book where Romanists argue like atheists.
Oh man, yeah. Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Well, some notes on like divinely inspired. Both Latter-day Saints and Catholics will a priori approach teens with a different set of assumptions. I know that's Captain Obvious. For Catholics, there is the dogma that the Bible, at least when it comes to the original autographs, are inerrant. it's very similar to the 1978 Chicago Statement on Inerrancy. You can see here the fourth session of the Council of Trent, 1546, where it says, the Synod of Trent followed the examples of the Orthodox Fathers, receives and holds in veneration with equal affection of piety and reverence all the books of both the Old and of the New Testaments, since one God is the author of both, and also the traditions themselves, those that appertain both to faith and to morals, as having been dictated. So note here, it's a dictation model, either by Christ's own word of mouth or by the Holy Spirit, and preserved in the Catholic Church by a continuous succession, and so that no doubt might arise in anyone's mind as to which are the books that are accepted by the Synod, as decreed that a list of the sacred books be added to this degree. And then they could list, like, say, the 73 books of the Catholic canon, including the 7 of the Deuterocanon. And the idea, like, say, biblical inspiration, plenary inspiration, at least for the autographs, is affirmed at Vatican I, Pastor Aeternus. You see, I'm not going to read all the slides here, but because one can download them. It's also reiterated in Providensimus Deus by Pope Leo XIII in November 1893. Pius XII, his Divino Afflante Spiritu 1943, which gave the go-ahead for Catholic scholars to use hierarchical methods of interpretation as long as they did not imbibe the atheistic, naturalistic assumptions and conclusions of these scholars. And you see this like in the works of, say, the 19th century cardinal convert from Anglicanism and a very good friend of John Henry Newman himself, Henry Edward Manning, where he says, it may be from an intellectual obtuseness or want of the critical faculty or obstinate adherence to preconceived belief, but it makes little impression to be told that Saint Stephen in Acts 7:16 fell into a historical error and say that Jacob was buried in Shechem. I confess I cannot explain the difficulty, and that the explanations usually given, though possible and even probable, are hardly sufficient. Nevertheless, I am not shaken in the least as to the divine axiom that Holy Scripture is exempt from all error, whether it be a fault in the manuscript or in the translator or only a want of understanding. I cannot tell. But an error in Scripture, most assuredly, it is not, and our inability to solve it is no proof that it is. So this is from his Temporal Mission to the Holy Ghost, page 173 from 1885. So this kind of shows like a cardinal of the Catholic Church in the 19th century, who was very well educated, did accept a priori from a Catholic perspective that the original autographs of the Bible were inerrant. And even as we see in the Council of Trent, there's a dictation theory as well. For more, there's a book by John F. McCarthy, who's a Catholic priest, Catholic Biblical Scholarship for the Third Millennium, that was published by Letter Publications, a very conservative venue, in 2017. Maybe I should actually, before I kind of continue, did you actually know, Stephen, that Catholics actually do believe in biblical inerrancy?
No. Well, I mean, you may have mentioned at some point before, we may have talked about it, but it wasn't something that comes front of mind when I think of Catholicism, right?
Yeah.
It's usually what I associate with like fundamentalist Protestantism. I know that there's the idea that when the Pope provides ex cathedra pronouncements on doctrine or on church policy, those pronouncements are considered infallible and absolutely authoritative. But I wasn't aware that that extended to the biblical text.
Yeah, I mean, it's really underplayed, but and if you go to, like, say, a Catholic seminary these days, like I went to Minute, they're very ashamed of this and they kind of ignore this because there's this very ambiguous statement in Vatican II Dei Verbum that says, like, Scripture is inspired and inerrant when it comes to matters of salvation. So, like, you have liberals and moderates who claim it only deals with, like, say, it deals with salvation, while others will claim it's inerrant in everything, especially when it comes to issues dealing with soteriology. And I think that's clearly how the Pope Paul VI understood it. I'm not going to go through the entire history, but yeah, there's
that's
an
interesting because
entire
at Catholic University of America, where I'm doing my PhD, at least in my Semitics department and in the Biblical Studies department, where I had lots of classes, including with both men and women in the seminary, so both priests and nuns in training, right? And I had Catholic professors. Like, we would pick apart the biblical text without a second thought about what, the infallibility or whatever, right? Like, we would repoint the Masoretic text all we wanted to make sense of weird passages, or we would go to Septuagint variants or Samaritan Pentateuch variants or whatever, right, to see what's going on. So yeah, that's why it never really occurred to me from my experience at basically the Catholic version of BYU that this would be kind of an official doctrine of the church.
Yeah, because like I kind of referenced like Divino Afflante Spiritu by Pius XII in 1943. Up until then, Catholic scholars and priests were not allowed to use historical methodology because that was seen as Protestant, because it came from Tübingen and stuff like that. Pius XII, however, said, you can use these methods, but don't imbibe the atheistic naturalistic assumptions and conclusions. So do it from a faithful perspective. And it's like the narrator, and they didn't.
Yeah, there you go.
So, yeah. So, okay. Now, Blake Ostler, who's a friend of mine, this is in the context of his review of how wide the divide, an excellent book between Robertson and Blomberg. He kind of critiques the Protestant doctrine of inerrancy, but what he says here kind of holds up when it comes to, say, the Catholic understanding as well. The doctrine of inerrancy of the originals is internally incoherent. One cannot consistently assert that the Bible is the basis of his or her beliefs, and then assert that one must nevertheless accept biblical inerrancy. This statement contains a number of assertions, propositions, if you will, that are not biblical. Inerrancy is not spelled out in the Bible. Nowhere do the words inerrant or infallible appear in the Bible, and the term theopneustos does not carry the muster, I will say. Such theoretical views are quite alien to the biblical writers. Further, inerrancy is not included in any of the major creeds. The assertion that the Bible is inerrant goes well beyond the scriptural statements that all scripture is theopneustos or God-breathed. Thus, inerrancy as a faith commitment is inconsistent with the assertion that one's belief are based on what the Bible says. The doctrine of inerrancy is an extra-biblical doctrine about the Bible based on non-scriptural considerations. It should be accepted only if it is reasonable, if it squares with what we know from Scripture itself, and not as an article of faith. And continue, the doctrine of inerrancy is untenable because it attempts to assert simultaneously that the written word in its entirety is revelation given by God, yet that we can somehow ignore obvious contradictions and pre-scientific assumptions contained in the Bible that are clearly wrong because somehow such views are not affirmed by the Scripture. This convenient exception to inerrancy, i.e. that the Bible is inerrant only in what it affirms, contradicts not only the notion of plenary inspiration asserted in Catholic teachings, that's my insertion here, as you see in the Council of Trent, but also seriously begs the question. For example, the Genesis creation story views the world as a three-tiered reality, with the great waters held above the vault of the earth, which was broken at the time of creation. The earth is a flat disk totally surrounded by waters. It is situated over the Sheol at the center of the earth. The book of Joshua makes it fairly clear that the sun stood still. For those of us living in the post-Copernican world, the sun does not go around the earth as Joshua presupposes. It should be noted, there are still geocentrists who are Roman Catholic. Robertson Jennis, for instance, of Catholic Apologetics International, is now well known for his multi-volume Galileo Was Wrong, The Church Was Right, and he's actually responded to both Aiken and Trent Horn on geocentrism. And I will say this here, if St. Jennis wants to debate these guys, I will happily act as a neutral moderator, just kind of show you don't have unity in Rome. So before we kind of move on, say one other assumption, and that's no more public revelation. Anything you want to add there, Stephen?
I did know that there were some Catholic holdouts on geocentrism. That is kind of a fun thing. And I'm not here to dunk on these guys because there's plenty of LDS Young Earth creationists or whatever. But that one I just kind of find funny, right? That there's actual diehard geocentrists still. And I get it. If you're coming from these presumptions as you're pointing out, then I totally get it, right? Why you would end up there. I just have
exegetically, from the Old Testament, exegetically, a better case can be made for geocentricity than any other model. So
totally.
From the biblical cosmology, it's clearly geocentric.
Well, I mean, I'm writing my dissertation on biblical cosmology, and believe you me, yes, from a modern scientific standpoint, there's plenty you can point to that are, shall we say, problematic with biblical cosmology, in the sense that the authors of the Hebrew Bible envisioned a cosmos that is quite different from ours. And so if you want to take this to its logical extent, then you end up at a geocentricity and probably a kind of young Earth creationist kind of position, or the flat Earth position, I should say, right? So this is we like to make fun of the flat Earth people, right? But if at least the flat Earthers who are all about the Bible says it's a flat Earth, well, yeah, it kind of does, right? So we have to get into that, but yeah, I did know that there were some holdouts there, and I find that kind of interesting.
And you know what they say about the Flat Earth Society? They have members all around the world.
All around the globe. Yeah, that's right.
Yes. Okay, one other assumption. This comes up when it comes to the very low IQ. The Book of Mormon is false because Rome is true argument. Roman Catholicism teaches that there's no such thing as public revelation after the 1st century. So you see this in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, section 66, where it actually quotes Dei Verbum from Vatican II. The Christian economy, therefore, since it is the new and definitive covenant, will never pass away, and no new public revelation is to be expected before the glorious manifestation of our Lord Jesus Christ. Yet, even if revelation is already complete, it has not been completely explicit. It remains for Christian faith gradually to grasp its full significance over the course of the centuries. So the TLDR is like, the Holy Spirit will guide the church into like having a better appreciation for the deposit of faith, better appreciation, like say the adoption of like the terminology to explain truths, like the adoption of a originally Gnostic term, homoousios, to explain the consubstantiality of the Father and Son, but there's no more public revelation. And this is Dei Verbum Vatican II, November 18th, 1965. I'm not going to quote all of it. Again, you can download the slides, but like, again, while this is not an infallible statement, it is a conciliar statement, so it's protected from, like, say, producing gross heresy. And this is like the Catholic dogmatic understanding. And anyway, Trent Horn, to his credit, will admit like the Bible itself does not teach the cessation of public revelation, at least explicitly. Contra some Protestants who will claim Jude 3 teaches it, where it speaks of the fate once for all delivered to saints, or more properly, once hapax delivered to the saints. And you see this in his book, The Case for Catholicism, pages 51 to 52. It's basically on the authority of the Catholic Church that he believes that there's no such thing as public revelation. So one might ask, like, what about private revelations? Because we could like spend the entire time on this, but like say, for instance, the Fatima revelations of Mary in 1917 are accepted as authentic by the Catholic Church. The same when it comes to, say, Bernadette Sturbone at Lourdes in 1858, and a host of other Marian apparitions have been accepted as being authentic. There is the belief in private revelation, but private revelations does not make dogmatic teaching. And one does not actually have to accept them, even when Rome has says, they're authentic. One just cannot disparage them or claim they're false. And a very good summary of, like, say, the role of private revelations is in this book by a Catholic author. One could quote also Mark Miravalli, who's a leading Mariologist, and others. In the century since the canon of sacred scripture was determined, many saints and mystics have claimed the gift of prophecy. Since all such comes under the heading of private revelation, it is never binding upon the faithful to believe. No matter how great the saint, we have no guarantee that every word found in his or her writings is infallible, especially when it comes to prophecy. When the cause of a proposed saint is introduced in Rome and the steps leading to canonization are begun, the writings are of the person are carefully examined to judge their content of holiness and to see if there's anything in them contrary to Catholic doctrine. If such writings are approved, or the Catholic, and such writings are approved for the acts of beatification, there is no guarantee that the Church accepts as authentic any prophecy found in them. It simply means that the prophecy is not in a contrary to faith or morals. This is like how some Catholics get around, like, say, how Mary in Fatima got the year wrong for the end of the First World War, the beginning of the Second World War. She was off by a year, I think. Private revelation, even when it's interpreted, could be like full of mistakes. So even authentic private revelation is not binding. It may be like a footnote, but it's not binding upon the conscience of people. So, but if you I was pretty active in the pro-life movement in Ireland, and I came across loads of SSPX types who are obsessed with Fatima. But be that as it may, there is like revelation, but only private revelation in Catholicism. There's no public revelation. There's no uppercase P or uppercase A apostles and prophets. And that is an important assumption that differs from the assumptions Latter-day Saints believe in, because we believe in ongoing public revelation. A priori, Roman Catholics do not. And that is an official Catholic teaching of their faith. And that comes out in Trent's really low IQ 4-point. Rome is true, ergo Book of Mormon is false. That might work for a Catholic audience, but for those who are like intellectually honest, I think that was a very silly argument. It's like claiming papacy is false because Joseph Smith's a prophet.
Yeah, I thought that was that one point he made was like transparently begging the question of whether the Book of Mormon is false, and to say, or uninspired, and to say it is because, well, and he quoted Matthew 16, the gates of hell will not prevail, right? I was like, yeah, okay, dude. Like, I know you as a debater. I know that you know that that's begging the question that we're here to debate anyways. So I wasn't.
He's too smart not to know it. Yeah,
right.
Trent has 3 earned master's degrees. He's not an idiot. So
right.
it was just like,
and I've seen him debate others, so I know
he
knows. Yeah, he knows logical fallacies and things like that. So it was disappointing that he.
There's 2 things. Like, it was obviously fresh meat to his Catholic audience who were just like lapping it up because they're not going to do any research on this. And I forget the second part, but oh, by the way, it's Novak's rule. Like, when you become an anti-Mormon, expect your IQ to drop 85 points. And I'm sorry, Trent, you're a smart guy, but like, imagine like if a Protestant were to debate you with these kind of level of arguments, you'd rightly call them out as jack shit fats. It's pretty bad.
Mm-hmm.
Now, One tactic I did tell Jacob in advance that he would do, he would try to like, well, there's some LDS scholars who believe the Book of Mormon took place in a heartland. He quoted this very dated book by Hammond arguing that the geography of the New World was changed radically, which I don't think anyone holds to anymore. And a host of other things is like, well, maybe I should ask this. Like, are you aware of like anyone with like a PhD in anthropology who holds to like a heartland model of Book of Mormon geography?
No, I thought that when he asked Jacob, he said, "Are you saying that anybody who believes that Heartland aren't actual academics?" Jacob should have said emphatically yes, but he kind of, hemmed and hawed on that. I'd probably guess because Jacob has a lot of Heartlanders in his audience, I would suppose. But I'm not afraid to say it. Correct. There are no Heartlander scholars that I'm aware of, in the sense that
And like,
there are
I think it would be like fair to say as well, like 95% plus, if not like 99% plus of all scholars who are trained, like say anthropology or the relevant fields, hold to some Mesoamerican model. And
at
that's been
least
like
those who
definitive
have
for
bothered to
decades.
go into print with it and who have bothered to actually publicly discuss it in academic research are all Mesoamerican dudes.
Yeah.
And yeah, they debate, which river is the site, is it Yosima Cinta or the Grijalva or whatever. I mean, but that's, you'd expect that happens in biblical geography questions, right? Things like that. But like predominantly academic Latter-day Saints in anthropology, in archaeology, and all this sort of stuff, right? They accept a Mesoamerican setting. I'm aware of at least one Latter-day Saint who they have not published about this, so I'll keep their identity private. But they are a specialist in North American pre-Columbian prehistory, right? So they're a specialist in the Hopewell and the Adena and these guys that the Heartlanders like to point to as being bookworm peoples. And this person is like, no, it took place in Mesoamerica, right? Like, so there are Latter-day Saint specialists in North American prehistory, right, or pre-Columbian history, and even they're like, no, it's almost certainly Mesoamerica, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, Jacob should have been a little more emphatic to say, yeah, no, there's no real Heartlander scholars. All the scholars, basically, the guys with real degrees and studying this extensively, all agree it's Mesoamerica.
Yeah.
And
I did
the
tell
whole the geography change, the Earth change. I mean, that's what sort of normie LDS authors have posited who don't know how like geography works, I guess. But
yeah, and
like
the Hammond
no
book came out
serious Book of
decades
Mormon
ago.
scholar has tried to do this. In fact, they shoot this idea down in order to make Book of Mormon geography work. John Sorensen, Brent Gardner,
Jerry Grover.
John Clark, Jerry Grover, all these guys, they reject that point. So that's a popular deal that some Latter-day Saint writers might use, but it's not a very informed one. It's not a serious one among the academic circles.
Yeah, I did tell him in advance he'd kind of do this kind of a really crappy tactic. So it should be known, like, say, Catholics are divided as to like where the books of Judith and Tobit, which are part of their canon, are historical or not, or if they're historical fiction. And that's significant, because the historical fiction view is actually very modern. Again, for people who are watching, I'm not going to like read all the slides. You can download them. But for instance, Trent Horn is actually open to the idea that both Tobit and Judith are like historical fiction. So he discusses like the historical problems when it comes to say the books of Judith and Tobit. And he says, like, for instance, James White calls this approach to the alleged errors in books like Judith an imaginative solution, which implies that it is ad hoc and unsound, but he does not interact with any of the evidence for non-literal nature of these texts. Scholars of Hellenistic Jewish literature, on the other hand, are well aware of how ancient authors use anachronism in order to underscore the didactic nature of their historical fiction. And he's following Jimmy Aiken in this. But one of the most important Catholic theologians of all time, Robert Bellarmine, who's my favorite Catholic theologian to read, he argues in his controversy on scripture that Tobit and Judah are actually historical, and he tries to defend Tobit and Judah on historical grounds. Again, you can go, I'm not going to read all the slides, people can download and read them for themselves, but he actually spends some time actually defending the historicity of Judah and Tobit. And so does Sungenis, who quotes Jacques Benige Bousset, who was a well-known Gallican, also arguing that the historical problems when it comes to Nebuchadnezzar and Judith are actually not problems. Arguing that Nebuchadnezzar in the Book of Judith is not, whether or not Nebuchadnezzar in the Book of Judith is king of Babylon or not, which is like one of the historical problems. And if you actually read Catholic apologetic literature, they're more than willing to functionally throw the biblical authors and the doctrine of biblical inerrancy under the bus. This is a book from Peter Bartley, one of the few anti-Mormon books published in my native Ireland, where he argues, this belief in the imminence of the end of the world was common in the early church. We know this from St. Paul's letters to the Thessalonians and first letter to Corinthians. Moreover, it seems clear from 1 Corinthians 7:25-32 that Paul himself shared this view, i.e. this incorrect view that Christ would come in their lifetime. And by the way, this is a view Jimmy Akin and Trent Horn actually believes in as well. Like in his debate from a few weeks ago against James White on purgatory, like of course 1 Corinthians 3 always comes up in purgatory debates. Trent actually argued that the day in verse 13 referred to the parousia or the eschaton, not necessarily like the day when individual people die, because in his view, Paul actually taught the parousia or the eschaton would actually be in his lifetime. And this is reflective in the text of 1 Corinthians 3. So, yeah, I mean, double standards and inconsistency are high when it comes to Catholic apologetics. Also Bartley in this book actually holds to like multiple authorship of Isaiah. I think something Trent Horn is open to. And Trent Horn, I know, is actually open to say 1st and 2nd Peter and the pastoral epistles actually perhaps being inspired pseudepigraphia as well.
Well, did you notice that Jacob got him on the authorship of John during the debate?
Yes, he did.
During
that was good.
Who are witnesses? What are our first-hand statements on the witnesses of the resurection?
Yeah,
he said, "What about John?" He said, "Do most scholars think John is written by John?" And the answer is no. Yeah.
Now I'm kind of well known for like having a very conservative view of like authorship and dating of the Gospels, but yeah, Jacob did a very good job at showing like if you want to appeal to like the majority of the scholars or the must scholars without backing up why they hold this view, yeah, Jacob got him good on that one.
Right.
And we'll be addressing the witnesses in a moment because Trent did a crap, disingenuous, deceptive job when it comes to the witnesses. I'm sorry. Okay, on Amnasticon, this is something like we both enjoy. One of his arguments was like, well, 1/3 of the names of the Book of Mormon actually can just be derived from like meshing together King James names. And apparently Joseph Smith had access to Josephus. And
the Book of Enoch and Richard Lawrence Enoch.
Yes. And the source is, trust me, bro. Yeah. Now, we do know like he did have a copy of Josephus later in his life, around the time he was producing the Book of Abraham. But
I actually don't think we know that, Robert. I think what we have is we have Oliver Cowdery quoting Josephus in the Messenger and Advocate around that time. I mean, it's certainly possible he had a copy. It was a commonly circulating book, right? But we could double check what's happening at the Nauvoo Lyceum, what the library at the Nauvoo Lyceum has, what was going to become the Nauvoo University, right? But I don't know that we actually do have evidence that Joseph Smith has a copy of Josephus during this. I don't mean to interrupt, but this is a little bee in my bonnet because Book of Abraham critics bring this up all the time too. They look to Josephus as a source for Joseph Smith getting stuff about Abraham teaching astronomy or whatever. Yeah. This is just to say Oliver Cowdery cites excerpts of Josephus, but Lincoln Blumel in his great article on this points out that Oliver could have been citing extracts from Josephus that were already appearing in circulation in like different newspapers or biblical commentaries. That was super common for biblical commentaries to extract Josephus. And B, we don't know that Joseph Smith is doing it, much less, as Trent liked to propose, that Joseph Smith was like quote mining Josephus and Enoch for names or weird names or whatever and meshing them up.
Yeah, and I'm unaware of like any evidence, like any knowledge or access to Josephus 1827 to 1829.
I don't think there's evidence for that either. I think the closest you have is when Isaac Hale, I think it's Isaac Hale, gives this later account where he pulled off the bookshelf a biblical commentary that had some Greek in it, and he wanted Joseph Smith to translate it with the Urim and Thummim to prove that they worked or something like that, right? So maybe there was some Josephus tucked in there, but yeah, there's no evidence as far as I'm aware that Joseph Smith is utilizing Josephus in the translation of the Book of Mormon.
And also, like, what did he get from Josephus that comes in the Book of Mormon?
Right. Yeah, that's the other point. This is all a red herring, anyways. Because, like, okay, so what names from Josephus show up in the Book of Mormon?
Yeah, I'm not going to lie to you. Like, I never heard that argument before. But yeah, so like one of these arguments is like Book of Mormon names are like meshing together biblical names, and that's how you explain it. Like, let's like focus on one example. Like the Tanners have argued that Mosiah in the Book of Mormon comes from like meshing together Moses and Isaiah, and perhaps Trent believes this. However, what's rather interesting, like there is a Hebrew term in the Bible, Moshiach, but it's never transliterated Moshiach in the King James or any other translation. It's always translated like something like savior or deliverer. And you see this in like Halot, which is like the leading Hebrew Aramaic lexicon for Old Testament nerds. a deliverer, savior. It's use of in people, but it's also use of God himself. And what's rather interesting, like there was a non-LDS scholar, John Sire, what was a Moshiach, that was published in 1965, where he discussed this term. So like, for instance, it's a word like victor, savior, deliverer, and how this refers to the Book of Mormon. The themes of physical and spiritual deliverance and salvation are central to the Book of Mosiah. The term Moshiach was used in antiquity to refer to a hero appointed by God who delivers an oppressed and afflicted people from injustice. Compare this with Benjamin, Ziniph, Alma, Gideon, Ammon, Mosiah II in the Book of Mosiah. The term designated a unique class or office in ancient Israel. Compare this with King Mosiah, who was the father of Benjamin, and Mosiah II, son of Benjamin. The term was later applied to God himself. One of the messages of the Book of Mosiah is that while God designates representatives, ultimately it is he himself who is the savior. Those in danger or those who are unjustly oppressed cry out for help and receive deliverance from a Moshiach. Compare this with the people of Ziniph, the people of Limhi, and the people of Alma, who all cry out for deliverance in such a manner. And this deliverance is frequently accomplished by a non-violent manner, or in a non-violent manner. And this is like a theme all throughout the Book of Mormon as well. So like, if you want to argue Joseph Smith got Mosiah by meshing together Moses and Isaiah, that might explain Mosiah, but it does not explain like how the term and its meaning reflects an authentic Hebrew term, and how that authentic Hebrew term and its nuances reflect like the entire Book of Mosiah as well. I mean, this is really reflective of, say, the Hebrew Egyptian wordplay all throughout the Book of Mormon. And major props to Matthew Bowen, I think, who has done the best work on this topic. These are like all the evidences that are consistent with a 19th century English translation of an ancient text. You can't really explain this away by simply just saying, well, he got like these names from the Bible and meshed them together. And when it comes to Nahum, it's 3 letters, and it may come from the prophet Nahum as well. I mean,
yeah,
it ignores so much.
That's one thing that Trent didn't handle, and really nobody, to my satisfaction, have handled, is not just you get the names, but how the names are used. And precisely to your point with Matt Bowen's research and others, it's not just that they're these cool sounding names, it's that they're used in the proper literary or theological context for where the name shows up. This is where the onomasticon comes together with the paronomasia, with the play on words, with the literary themes, with the theological themes, all that sort of stuff. That is next level from Joseph Smith just making up rando names or meshing them together from Josephus or wherever. That's one thing to do. It's another thing to then use them properly in their narrative or theological context.
And props for like Jacob bring up, like, say, the Gershon inheritance one.
Yes, that's another example.
That's an excellent one. For the TLD or Gershon or Yershon, Yerash, to inherit, own, place of. So yeah, place of inheritance, and there's like word place in the Book of Alma where Gershon is given as a place of inheritance. Again,
are you sure it's not JWW though? I heard from Zelf on the Shelf that it's JWW means to inherit something, right?
Maybe in Paleo Hebrew, who knows?
Yeah, right. What do I know? I'm just a Semitics PhD guy, but I don't know. I'm pretty sure it's JWW.
I just did like biblical medieval Hebrew until postgraduate level. What the heck would I know?
Yeah, what do I know about what the word inherit means? Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Zelf on the Shelf, for that wonderful. It's the gift that keeps on giving with meaning on these people, is their JWW argument. That's pretty good.
And for those who don't know, on both our respective blogs, we kind of discussed this. It's one of the funniest self-owns by critics on the internet, but it's wonderful, especially the memes that were produced. But we can discuss that maybe momentarily. Like, one of my favorite evidences outside, say, the Arabian Peninsula geography and wordplays and names is actually this, and I'm glad he actually brought this up. It's like Mulek, the son of Zedekiah. Now, Trent, who was raised atheistic Jew, so maybe he knows some Hebrew. I know he took a few years of Attic Greek. He does not know what a hyperchoristic form of a name is. So he said, like, well, first of all, he butchers the pronunciation of Malkayahu or Malkayahu. So whether or not he actually knows Hebrew, that's going to be another thing. But Smoot, can you actually tell us, like, what a hyperchoristic form is, and why Mulek could actually be a hyperchoristic form of the longer name that appears in the Hebrew of the King James?
Yeah,
that's not
hypochoristic.
Also,
it's hypochoristic is just a fancy term for a short version of a name. Yeah. And typically it's a form of a name that has dropped the theophoric element, right? We do this in English, right? Samuel becomes Sam, right? So hypochoristic, it's just a shortened version of a name. And in biblical Hebrew, or biblical names, or Israelite Semitic names, typically what gets dropped is the theophoric element, right? And we don't know why exactly it does it. It could be just how the name evolves, could be to preserve the name of God. There's all sorts of theories for why, but that's the short version of what that is.
And for those who are wondering, Theophoric just refers to the divine name element.
The divine element. So so Samuel, Shmuel, God has heard.
Yeah.
You would drop that and you would get Sam, right? So Malkiyahu Ben
I'm sorry, Smith. Sam is a Yankee name. It's clearly an anachronism in the Book of Mormon.
Yankee name, yep. It appears in the Book of Mormon. It's a Yankeeism.
Actual criticism that still happens.
It still shows up sometimes. That's attested. Malkiyahu ben Hamelech. This guy appears in Jeremiah, right? You probably have the reference up there, but
Jeremiah.
There it is. So King James translates it as Hamelech, as if it's a proper name. It's not. It's Malkiyahu, the son of the king, right? In the 90s, I forget the precise year, but these little signet seals from Jerusalem were discovered the date to the time of Zedekiah.
1997, yeah.
97, yeah, okay, yeah, so late 90s. And one of them contains, let's see, I think you have it right here. Yeah, there it is. So it's this little signet seal, Le Malkiyahu ben Hamelech, belonging to or for Malkiyahu, the son of the king. And Jeffrey Chadwick was the first one to point this out back in the 90s in his awesome article about this. Yeah, there you have it. Oh, I guess it was later. It was discovered in the 90s, and then Jeff Chadwick published on it. There you go, in 2003, pointing out that this fits all the criteria that we need for Mulek, our Mulek from the Book of Mormon. He is the son of Zedekiah. He has the right name. It's the hypochoristic form. And I even believe it's kind of anecdotal. I don't think he put it in press, but I believe when John Welch pointed this out to David Noel Friedman, even David Noel Friedman of all people was like, oh man, if Joseph Smith got that one right, then he's pretty good, right?
That was in the presence of Robert F. Smith, and that's been verified by Bob.
Okay, so there's a second source for it that even biblical scholars have recognized, very prominent ones like David Noel Friedman have recognized, right, that our Mulek in the Book of Mormon satisfies everything you need to have him be Malkiyahu ben Hamelech. And so Trent Horn to say, well, it's actually Malkiyahu, it's like saying, well, my friend Robert Boylan, well, no, or my friend Bob Boylan. No, it's actually Robert Boylan, right? Like, come on, dude. This is how names work.
No, it's actually Robert E. Boylan,
thank you very much. And being kind of pedantic about the full name or whatever. But Jeff Chadwick's article is very good. He lays out all the groundwork for this.
Yeah.
I
think the only debate now is like, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if this Mulek guy wasn't in the Book of Mormon, if he was in some other inscriptional, epigraphical piece of material, I can almost guarantee you people would be saying, oh yeah, this is almost certainly this guy, right? I agree. I don't think there'd be any real controversy that this Mulek is this Malkiyahu ben Hamelech from this signet seal inscription. But because it's the Book of Mormon, and that involves gold plates and angels and ancient Nephites, suddenly it's like weird for people, right? Including for Trent Horn. So that's the short and dirty of Malkiyahu and Mulek and all that sort of good stuff.
So basically, we actually have an attestation of a unique Book of Mormon character. So how many works in 19th century fiction can actually claim that?
Right.
And to be fair, like there's a debate, like he's like son of the king, like is it a revival title or is it like more of a biological terminology? There's like some debate there. But he would still either way be known as son of a king. And this is like, I have never seen any meaningful interaction by critics of this. And for me, I think this is an absolute bullseye. I agree with what Jeff Lindsay says in the slide. Either Joseph was a miraculously lucky guest here, or he was a divinely inspired prophet of God. And if you don't argue like an atheist or you don't have atheistic assumptions, I just think it's easier to assume, like, again, this is consistent with what the Book of Mormon claims to be. It's a 19th century English translation of an ancient text, So anything else you want to go on before we kind of discuss She'um?
Just that I know you and I both know a prominent, he used to be prominent on the old message boards. He's not very involved these days, but he was a critic of both the Book of Mormon and the Book of Abraham. And at one point, somebody asked him on one of these old message boards, what do you think is the best evidence for the Book of Mormon? And he pointed to Mulek and the seal of Malkiyahu ben Hamelech and all of Chadwick's stuff on this. And so I know that there are Book of Mormon critics who have acknowledged this is one of the best pieces of evidence that the Latter-day Saints have for the Book of Mormon.
And here's the thing: like, if I was Trent, I was I was back in my Catholic days, I would probably have to say, like, there's some things I can't explain that are consistent with it, but maybe like the overwhelming body of evidence
Yeah.
Makes me think like I'll get answers someday, like a reverse LDS apologist when it comes to these difficult issues we have. But again, like his interaction with what Jacob says was very weak, and it's not like say this is not well discussed. These are very well discussed issues. It's not like say super esoteric stuff that only people who know Hebrew, like myself and you and maybe Alan Hansen, can discuss like every second Friday. That's not shared with anyone else. These are well discussed and have been discussed for decades. Like the Shadwick article came out in 2003. Bob Smith was writing about it in the 1980s, for crying out loud. And this is just like the tip of the iceberg, like the Arabian Peninsula stuff that's been discussed since the 70s. And Warren Aston, who's done like excellent work on the topic, he's been writing on this like since the late 1980s at least, So, okay, She'um and Neas. I'm just going to focus on She'um. But like in the Book of Mormon, we read in Mosiah 9:9, and we began to till the ground, yea, even with all manner of seeds, with all seeds of corn, and of wheat, and of barley, with Nes, and with She'um, and with seeds of all manner of fruit, and we did begin to multiply and prosper in the land. And critics have actually harped on this, but if you read the Assyrian Dictionary of Oriental Institute of the University of Chicago, Volume 17, Part 2, there's actually She'u or She'um, barley, grain, measure, pine nuts from Old Akkadian Sumerian loan word. You see this here like She'am and She'am. But what's rather interesting, like there was an article that also came out that actually transliterated this logograph in the same way as the Book of Mormon, She'um. And this is Mark Whedon, the Akkadian word for grain, and the god Haya in the Welt des Orient.
Robert, you just broke my heart.
I'm sorry. How would you pronounce it?
Die Welt des Orients. Die Welt des Orients. Sorry, okay. I just have to because I'm a German nerd.
Well, German is like one of the next languages I hope to learn. So yeah. But like Akkadian had two words for meaning grain, barley, associated with the Sumerian She'a or She'um. And again, She'um and Au clearly exist in Akkadian. So like this non-LDS scholar who probably has never come across the Book of Mormon actually transliterates it as She'um. So again, we have a grain from Sumerian/Akkadian consists with the Jaredites influencing the Nephites, and it's translated exactly as She'am or She'um. So I don't know about you, but I think this is like a direct hit when it comes to say Book of Mormon stuff. It's like, how could Joseph actually fake this, especially when Akkadian and Sumerian were not deciphered until a few decades after he's dead as well?
I'm sure he got it from Josephus.
No, he got from View of the Hebrews.
There you go. He got it from Ethan Smith. Exactly.
Actually, because you've done a lot of work on View of the Hebrews, you want to like address even briefly the BS claim that View of the Hebrews influenced in some way the Book of Mormon? Because he quoted Fawn Brody.
He did. Yeah, he quoted Fawn Brody as this mic drop moment of View of the Hebrews. Yeah, I'll try to keep it simple so not get too far afield. Basically, when the Spalding theory was dying, when it's on its last legs, right? Critics of the Book of Mormon and those looking for a naturalistic explanation for the Book of Mormon had to find a substitute. And the substitute they found was View of the Hebrews. So this is just one of many works from the time that are a part of what are called the Hebraic Indian theory for the origins of Native Americans. So this is the idea that the ancestors of Native Americans are the lost tribes of Israel. So that's the big argument that Ethan Smith is trying to make in View of the Hebrews. And he makes the argument by saying, number one, biblical prophecies and biblical passages seem to indicate the lost tribes of Israel got to America. And the second argument is, well, gee, I've spoken to all these Indians and they have these weird words that sound like Hebrew, so they must be Jews, right? I mean, that's kind of straw manning it, but that's the basic idea behind Ethan Smith's idea is Native American language and customs and culture are really similar to what the Jews do and what's in the Bible, and also biblical passages in Isaiah and elsewhere talk about the lost tribes getting to America. Okay, so this book exists. It's written first in 1823 and then republished in 1825. It gets national distribution. It gets reviewed and discussed in different places. And Fawn Brody wasn't the first one to point this out. On the Mormoner.org website, you can see I tracked down sources before Fawn Brody. So I Woodbridge Riley, he's one of the big guys who points this out. Others are being, and they point that out as one source of many that could have potentially influenced Joseph Smith. Fawn Brody was the one who kind of made everybody dumber by focusing unduly on View of the Hebrews as a source of inspiration for Joseph Smith, right? So she is saying that, well, she says we can never prove that it's possible, nudge, nudge, but it's really interesting. There's all these parallels between the Book of Mormon view of the Hebrews. I mean, just read the book and decide for yourself if these parallels really are as striking or as significant as Von Brody says they are and as Trent Horn says they are. I'm absolutely convinced that Trent Horn has not read View of the Hebrews. Like, gun to my head,
I
I would
agree.
absolutely bet that he has not read a word of View of the Hebrews, that he read Von Brody's summary view of the Hebrews, and he ran with that as a source of Joseph Smith's plagiarism, right? So, yeah, go to the Mormoner.org website to see what I've written about that. But the basic punchline is, okay, here's a book in the 1820s saying that Native Americans might be descendants from the lost tribes of Israel. Gee, there are some vague parallels with the Book of Mormon, right? Like Jews getting to America or whatever. Therefore, it's a source of plagiarism. I mean, that's up to people to decide for themselves. I'm not at all convinced. I don't think that Trent Horn, like I said, is at all well equipped to discuss the
I agree.
major problems with this theory. I can't remember if he tried to point to the Oliver Cowdery connection. People try to do that. It's much more tenuous than people try to make it out to be. David Persuit wrote a book in the 80s trying to argue that Oliver Cowdery is the main connection between this. He's the guy behind it all. No, not really. So anyways, I can go on and on, but that's the punchline of View of the Hebrews. When the Spalding theory died, people needed a substitute. They pointed to Ethan Smith's View of the Hebrews, and you can just kind of read it for yourself and decide whether you think it's a source of plagiarism. My big deal, and to his credit, guys like I, Woodridge, Riley, and others, they were more careful. They pointed out that this is one source of many that Joseph Smith could have gotten for this idea of the Hebraic origin of the Indians, right? So there's Elias Boudinot, there's James Adair, there's Ethan Smith, there's multiple authors discussing this idea. Mordecai Noah, who's a Jew in early America, there's multiple guys pushing this theory. He doesn't have to have gotten it from Ethan Smith. Like, he wasn't the only guy that woke up one day and said, I think that Indians are Jews. That wasn't what was going on. So if you're more careful with it, also, I think Dan Vogel, to his credit, is more careful to say this is one potential environmental source that could have been part of the discourse going on. But to hone in on Ethan Smith as Von Brody and Trent Horn did is just kind of dumb.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think Trent has actually read the book. And, definitely check out like mormonor.org for like, say, primary research on like, say, View of the Hebrews, as well as like B.H. Roberts and his testimony, because usually that goes hand in hand with these parallels.
Yeah, that one radicalizes me. I know we've talked about this, about how people misuse B.H. Roberts and misrepresent what his stuff was on that, but that's, thankfully, Trent Horn didn't do that, so we don't need to get into it here.
Yeah, but just in case people, because sometimes they go hand in hand. But like, there's an entire chapter in View of the Hebrews, which is like the most boring book on earth, where like there's a lot of words between like Semitic languages and Amerindian languages.
Yeah.
Like, there's pages and pages upon it. It's like, how many appear in the Book of Mormon? 0.
Right.
So it
well,
doesn't
what's funny is, who loves that is the Heartlanders. The Heartlanders quote that stuff. It's true. I've got Heartlanders quoting View of the Hebrews, which is kind of funny.
They actually quote in the annotated Book of Mormon, I think, that you reviewed. So yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of fun.
Jeez. I hate it when like often well-meaning people actually just like shoot us in the foot, but yeah.
Well, I mean, let's take a step back here just for one more minute.
Go ahead.
Let's be very clear about something. The Book of Mormon does not posit that the Native Americans are descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. The lost tribes of Israel have nothing to do with the Book of Mormon. We are talking about a group of Ephraimites and Manasseites that come over, and the Jaredites are pre-Israelite. These guys are like early old Babylonian dudes from down in Babel, right down in southern Mesopotamia. Like, they have nothing to do with the lost tribes of Israel. The Book of Mormon says nothing about, oh, the Indians are the lost tribes of Israel and whatever, right? Like, this is the cardinal mistake that these people are making here. And Elizabeth Fenton and others who are more careful with this, they point out that the Book of Mormon shares some broad conceptual similarities with stuff like View of the Hebrews. But you cannot say that it's a direct borrowing, because if that's the case, then Joseph Smith is not borrowing the central thesis of Ethan Smith, which is all about the lost 10 tribes that were scattered in 722 BC when the Assyrians overrun the northern kingdom, right? So, like, right off the bat, you've got a problem for saying this is a source of plagiarism, because if he's doing that, he's not plagiarizing the main point of the book. And yes, besides the little details that you're talking about, like the words and the names and things like that. He also doesn't plagiarize the major sort of proofs that Ethan Smith uses to try to prove that Native Americans are descendants from Israelites, right? So he's not drawing on like circumcision's a big deal for Ethan Smith. The fact that the Indians are circumcising their kids,
Yeah,
the fact
circumcision
that they have
divination
like
was in the Book
purity
of Mormon.
laws.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, the fact they have like purity laws that seem to parallel what's in the law of Moses. Like Book of Mormon doesn't care about any of that stuff, right? So, anyways, I can go on and on. Jack Welch's article on this is very good, showing all the quote the unparallels. And so that's worth also considering as well, which again, just say it again, I'm absolutely convinced, I'd bet $1 million that Trent Horn has not read View of the Hebrews, and he has not looked behind any of this. He saw that paragraph in Fawn Brody's book, and he just ran with it and called it a
yeah.
day.
And for me, the greatest, all it took was like reading View of the Hebrews just to realize like the idea like Joseph was dependent upon it is bollocks. I think if I was like a reasonable critic, and I know we converse about this, I would say it's evidence of the milieu in which he lived, and he may have like got some ideas from it.
Yes, the most you can say is that, and this is what Fenton and others do, is to say the Book of Mormon and View of the Hebrews are both parallel manifestations of this broader phenomenon of the Hebraic Indian theory, right, for the origins of Native Americans. But you can't go beyond that. And attempts to show direct dependence have fallen flat. And like I've said, just go read the book for yourself and decide if you think that this is a source of Joseph Smith plagiarism. Despite the fact that we have no evidence he's aware of it, despite the fact we have no evidence that he has Ethan Smith access, or he can have access to it, but we don't have evidence he actually has it and he's using it, right? At least not until Nauvoo, when he quotes it one time, which also raises an interesting question. That's not behavior we'd expect from a plagiarist. Besides all of that, the most you can say is these are parallel manifestations of this Hebraic Indian theory stuff that's circulating in North America.
Yeah, before we like move on to the Arabian Peninsula stuff, like Trent had like threw out one or two things, and I think you talked about them before, but like Lucy Mack Smith's memoirs that Joseph actually recited these.
Oh man, that one drives me nuts too.
Yeah, okay, so like the argument, and Trent repeats this a lot. This is not new to him. Like Lucy, his mom, recalls how just before the Book of Mormon was produced, Joseph would enthrall his family with these tales of the American Indians and their method of dress and their civilization. So we kind of know like he was intellectually able, like at a recital level, to like tell these grand narratives of the Amerindians. So you can't really so like a lot of Jacob Hansen's arguments are like neutralized as a result. So what do you think that's an absolute quote line?
Okay. Yes. And I've discussed this elsewhere. I discussed it with Stephen Murphy recently and Neil Rapley, right? Because people bring it up all the time. Okay, the context of that quote from Lucy Mack Smith, from her memoir, her 1845 memoir of her and her son and her family, it is specifically in the context of Joseph Smith got the plates from the angel. The angel was teaching stuff to Joseph Smith and giving him revelatory downloads that Joseph Smith was then turning around and telling us as a family. Okay, so you read that quote in the context of her narrative of her history, and it's very clear she and her family members are all believers. They believe that this kid has seen an angel and has gold plates. And the angel is telling him stuff, and he is learning stuff from the angel that he then is turning around and reciting to the family in their fireside evening chats or whatever, right? It is absolutely not the case that Lucy Mack Smith thinks that Joseph Smith has this creative imagination, and that he's just, how funny is a lad? He was coming with all these crazy stories about Indians. No, that is not the context of what she's saying, okay? So when people quote it that way, it drives me nuts, because it tells me that they haven't read the narrative context of her history and what she was actually getting at, okay? For goodness sake, his mom is a diehard believer until she dies. And by the way, Trent and others that want to quote that, guess what Lucy describes doing in her history? She describes handling the Urim and Thummim under a silk handkerchief when Joseph Smith came home with the plates and handed them to the family, right? So you're not going to get out of Lucy Smith that Joseph Smith is just telling tall tales as a kid, right, and had this youthful imagination. That has been misused by anti-Mormons since like at least the late 19th century when her memoirs were getting published. And it drives me nuts every single time. If you want to say as a critic or as a skeptic that Joseph Smith has an active imagination, fine, you can say that. You can even say that Lucy Smith maybe is saying that, but or you can extrapolate from that quote if you want to, or you can make a personal inference from that if you want to, but you cannot say even Lucy Mack Smith said that her kid had an active imagination, because that's not what she's saying with that quote.
Yeah, and like one of the other things he brings up against like either the limited geography and or bring up DNA stuff is like, well, Joseph said that the eastern The Amerindians on the east were like descendants of Joseph of Egypt. Two things. The mathematic of genealogy. I mean, after like a certain number of generations, everyone would have like a lineage to Lehi. And this has been discussed again for decades. And two, again, it's kind of the intentionalist fallacy that Joseph was a competent interpreter of the Book of Mormon. He was its translator, but that does not mean like he knew the ins and outs of the text very well. He had to learn. And you kind of see it's like when it comes to like how he viewed the Book of Mormon geography, initially he thought it was like all over the place, but near the end of his life, come fight me, Heartlanders, he did seem to think like it may have been like situated largely in Central America,
Well, I mean, he either he writes or he approves as editor. He approves these publications in the Times and Seasons. Kirigua, I think it's Kirigua, becomes Zarahemla, and the Narrow Neck is the Isthmus of Darien, right? Like down there. So once he gets a hold of Stevens and Catherwood, so right. John Clark made this point, and I think he's right. Joseph Smith, if we look at him as the translator of the book, that does not bestow upon him this infallible, all-knowing knowledge of where the events of the book take place. And he is as much an interpreter of the book as anybody else is. His job is to be a translator of the Book of Mormon. That's what God calls him to do. But again, that does not magically make him an infallible expert on everything about the book. That just means that he was given the divine power to translate it and to produce it and to give it to us. So yes, I agree with you on that.
Yeah, sure. Okay, let's kind of move on to the Nahum and Bountiful in the Arabian Peninsula. I was half expecting it, but like I never heard Trent deal with any of this before, so I was half expecting him, if he did, to like bring up the Nahum's just 3 letters, which he did. By the way,
just 3 letters, man. That's all it is.
Yeah, and it comes from biblical Nahum anyway. So, by the way, shout out to your mutual friend Neil Rapley, who, alongside Warren Ass and others, has done like stellar work, especially on Nahum. But this is like a quick TLDR of the Arabian Peninsula geography. What's rather interesting, like in 1 Nephi 1634, unlike the other place names in the Old World, like Bountiful, River of Laman, and so forth, this is actually in the passive, not the active voice, showing that it's a pre-existing place name. So the root Nahum means to groan and appears in the Hebrew Bible and may reflect a wordplay based on the actions of the daughters of Ishmael in the next verse, how they did mourn exceedingly because of lost their father. This kind of wordplay, even on place names, is rather common in antiquity. There's also a burial site, Nahum, NHM, located south-southeast of Jerusalem, consistent with the Book of Mormon in 1 Nephi 16:13 and verse 33. In recent years, altars from Yemen attesting the antiquity of the place name Nahum as a burial site has been discovered where Book of Mormon Nahum would be. These are the first archaeological artifacts attesting the Book of Mormon place name outside the Bible, i.e. Jerusalem, etc. If one travels nearly eastward from Nahum, they end up at Wadi Sak in Oman. According to most Book of Mormon scholars, e.g. Warren Aston, this fits perfectly the Bountiful as described in 1 Nephi 17 and 18. Here's a picture. This is a map of the geography of 1 Nephi. What's rather interesting, like even outside, like say the geography, there's like a lot of internal consistencies in the book that makes sense if Nephi, not Joseph Smith, wrote it. For instance, Warren Aston, in his book Lehi and Sariah in Arabia, page 37, embedded in the opening chapters of Nephi's account is another remarkable testament to his ability to record accurate, real-world geographical facts. As a native of Jerusalem, Nephi knew firsthand that travel from the city in the Judean mountains in any direction literally meant going down from it, and that to travel to Jerusalem was to go up. Jerusalem's elevated geography is further uniquely accentuated by the huge Wadi Araba to its east, containing the Dead Sea, some 1,300 feet below sea level. In no less than 25 instances, Nephi's first-hand record correctly uses the terms in the same manner that biblical writers also did when discussing the various travels of the family to and from Jerusalem. This consistency is a striking affirmation of the record's historicity. What's rather interesting, like the name Bountiful, some critics have actually claimed this is a problem. For instance, in 1 Nephi, it is stated that they traveled eastward from the wilderness to Bountiful. Nephi is Hebrew. How did he come up with a name like Bountiful? Bountiful in English originated in the mid-15th century. Again, it's a translation, my dude. But that be it, that is me. Sayani Zavish, in What Really Happened in the Garden of Eden, 2015, wrote the following. Since the name Eden itself evoked the image of an agriculturally productive area, it is not surprising that the word appears in the name of another locale. The prophet Amos refers to the kingdom of Beth Eden, part of a coalition of Aramaic-speaking groups centered in Damascus. This place is identified with Bet Adini, a kingdom located on both sides of the Euphrates, where the Alik River flows into from the north. Its name translates as House of Bounty. The garden was planted in a place called Bountiful. The major wonder of this particular garden on the eastern side of Eden / Bountiful may have been its landlord, who could guarantee rain, and it kind of goes on. So the term bountiful is actually a translation of Eden, which kind of fits very well with the Edenic-like nature of bountiful as described in the Book of Mormon. And there's a lot more stuff like the Ishmael inscription, the funerary stele, I should say, that Neil rapidly has discussed, which may not be Book of Mormon Ishmael, but like more or less right time and right place. So who knows? We don't. Neil has taken as far as I think it can be taken, and have a host of other considerations. So it's not simply Nahum is just 3 letters. It's like, no, it's a pre-existing place name. The passive voice is intentionally used because the active voice is used everywhere else. By the way, Neil rapidly has shown it's not just a tribal name, it's also a place name in BYU Studies and Interpreter. This is like the best conversions of evidence for Book of Mormon historicity, and Trent did a crap job. And I think he never knew about this until like coming up to this debate, because you can see like his arguments are really low IQ when it comes to the Book of Mormon, especially Nahum. Like, it's not just 3 letters. I mean, that's just, I'm sorry. I laughed when he said that.
No,
any comments you want to make?
As with View of the Hebrews, I'm absolutely convinced that Trent has not read the scholarship on this. He probably Googled, Book of Mormon Nahum or whatever, and he found like the Mormon Think website or some Reddit website or something. And because the arguments he gave against it were not these well-considered, thoughtful responses that you would expect, it was just, but it's just 3 letters, bro. So yeah, as with View of the Hebrews, I'm convinced he doesn't have a clue on the actual scholarship on Nahum from Neil, from Warren Aston, from all sorts of people who have talked about this.
And this has been discussed for decades. It's not like a new thing that only, like, say, the last few weeks or
just
months.
Barely,
it's not like, it's not like, say, like, just out of the blue, like in 1 week, or this was like the unpublished article that no one was allowed to share until day beforehand. This has been discussed in books and articles for decades.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's all I have to say. I agree with you. I mean, I know I'm a little bit biased because Neil and I have published on Nahum, so I have a little bit of an investment in this particular topic. But yeah, it was disappointing that was just Trent's response. It's just 3 letters. It's not that impressive. Besides, there's biblical Nahum, the biblical book of Nahum. I'm like, okay, dude, that doesn't come anywhere near close to addressing the evidence we have on hand and explaining it.
And maybe this is me, but I know Ben McGuire holds this view, and I think you guys would hold to this as well. How we have found Book of Mormon Nahum, and we know it's Book of Mormon Nahum, it's like similar to, like, say, how we know certain biblical place names are consistent with the biblical place names themselves.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the same methodology and discoveries and convergences match Nahum as it does for like many biblical sites as well.
Absolutely.
So again, you have to argue like an atheist, or in this case, a minimalist, in order to critique the Book of Mormon. So
yep.
Yeah. And of course, like, I think it's a bit more disputable. Like, I do think, like, say, overall, I think George Potter is onto something when it comes to, say, he's candidate for the River of Laman and Valley of the Mule. I think it fits with the direction, the distance contra Dan Vogel. But when it comes to Nahum and Bountiful, I think that's much more solid. And there's a lot of stuff going on. But yeah, props, like, especially Neil in recent years, he has done excellent work. And interpreters, like, bringing together, like, some articles they published on the Arabian Peninsula geography into a book that will be coming out later this year as well. So, yeah. Okay, horses were mentioned, and horses and chariots were mentioned. So, what do you think are the odds he's unaware of, like, the recent discoveries in the last year or two that late
I think
Wade
the odds
Miller?
are pretty good.
Yeah, okay. When it comes to horses, again, look at the Book of Mormon Anachronisms Project. But there was an article by Wade Miller et al. And it should be noted, Wade was the only Latter-day Saint in the study. Everyone else was not a Latter-day Saint. Post-Pestostone Horses, Equus from Mexico, that was published in 2022. So this is like a newish article, but it's been discussed so many times by Latter-day Saints. Trent should be familiar with this. This is a table given a description, like, say, the bones and like how they've been dated before present. Some of them are consistent with Book of Mormon chronology. So it's not simply like horses were introduced by Columbus and after dying out, like in the Pestostone era, circa 10,000 years ago. Horses in the Book of Mormon by Scripture Central. It's a very good write-up. It is particularly interesting to compare these latest findings to the dating of various Book of Mormon references to horses. Two of the radiocarbon dates found near horse remains came from the mid-second millennium BC, thereby spurring references to horses during Jaredite times. Another dates to the 6th or 5th century BC, which is chronologically close to Lehi's arrival in the Promised Land, when Nephi saw horses there. And to Enos's time, when the Nephites had many horses. The final mention of horses in the Book of Mormon comes during the Gadianton siege in the 1st century AD, and 2 radiocarbon dates support the presence of horses around this time as well. Thus, if these findings are valid, they support the existence of horses in all periods of the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon mentions them in. So before we kind of discuss like him poo-pooing like loan shifting, especially for tapirs and horses, what are your views on like say these? I know they're still a bit tentative, but like personally, I think like they're really important discoveries. So like,
oh, for sure, they're very
Yeah.
promising discoveries. It'd be great to do follow-up work to see how this pans out. If we can find more specimens, that would be great, right? I put this in the category of tentative or sort of trending towards confirmation, right? You know, there's a lot more to be discussed about, well, how wide, you know, if you find one little pit of horse bones, okay, that's great, but you know, how far does that extend? How far were these animals domesticated? Blah, 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 blah. There's all these additional things to sort of talk about. But hey, it's cool that we've got horse bones. It's just the implications of such we need further research. And to his credit, that's what Miller and these guys are saying, right? Is this requires further fleshing out and further study to fully kind of understand why maybe it's significant. But yeah, it's kind of neat.
Yeah, and it's not like, say, as clear anachronism as Trent believes it to be. And it would have been awesome, and it would show like intellectual integrity if Trent actually interacted with this, as opposed to horses were not introduced until Columbus.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's really, come on, man.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, no, we have Pleistocene horses. There's horses or horse bones from like, you know, 10,000 BC or whatever, right? In the La Brea tar pits or whatever. The question is not, were there horses in ancient America? It's, what kind of horses, and did they survive into the Holocene so that humans could domesticate them in the time the Book of Mormon does? That's sort of the big controversy. This idea that the Spanish introduced horses. Well, okay, sure, Equus, the genus Equus from Europe or whatever, but like there are Equus subspecies, or you know, that were from the Pleistocene. So he, again, that's just kind of the old school misunderstanding of what's actually at stake or what's actually being discussed here. It's not just as simple as that.
Yeah, no, I don't personally. I think Book of Mormon horses are some type of equus. I don't believe they're tapirs. But that be it as it may, like the Spanish, you probably know this, but like, guess what the Spanish called the tapir when they first encountered it?
Yeah,
Antipora, which means formerly, or an ass, formerly an ass.
Yeah,
but
yeah, they called it a donkey or a horse.
Yeah,
people were doing this in both directions. Yeah.
So Trent's understanding, like say, how loan shifting works. Again, maybe he's a monoglot like Dan Vogel, but it's really embarrassing. But what's rather interesting, like, and I remember sharing this with you, and you thought this really cool when you first found this. This comes from Michael Coe, who's definitely not a believer in the Book of Mormon. He's now deceased. Breaking the Maya code. If I see 3 horses in the pasture from a Mayan perspective, I would count them as ox, tul, tezamine. Ox, tree, tul, classifier for animatines, tezamine, horse, or tapir. So the Mayan word for horse was also the same Mayan word for tapir.
Yeah.
So the connection between horses,
What do you know? Oh my gosh.
The Mayans never existed.
Shifting. Yeah.
Yeah. So again, this is not just a once off. You see this, for instance, here in the book by Macri and Looper, New Catalog of Maya Hieroglyphs, 2 volumes, volume 1, page 78. Again, it can refer to either a horse or a tapir.
Yeah.
There's also, again, you see this, for instance, David Drew, and he's The Lost Chronicles of the Maya Kings, 389 to 90. I'll let people read this, but like tezamine, shak, horse, same term for tapir, of thunder and lightning. You know, so yeah, I mean, I know personally, I think he kind of focused on, like, say, the weaker anachronisms. If it was me, I would just like focus on pre-classical metallurgy. But
oh yeah, there's so many better anachronisms you can hone in on. That's one of them. Pre-classic Mesoamerican metallurgy. Yeah. I mean, you could get into, I mean, that's the big one. I mean, horses, for some people that's a big one, but yeah, Liku, I don't know. How about there's other flora and fauna that are more problematic than horses, I think, right? But like metallurgy is the big one.
And to be fair, they did have a word in Mesozoic, or like pre-Mesozoic, around 1500 BC for metal and metallurgy. So it seems like linguistically they were aware of it, just like dirt archaeology is not caught up yet. But yeah, again, for me, and you know, we both worked on the Anachronisms project. I think that's the quote unquote better one out there for like a New World context. Mm-hmm. But there's like hints that, you know, maybe like in 25 to 50 years time, who knows where we will be? We'll probably be in a much better place. You know, I know that's.
I know one Mesoamerican archaeologist that has told me as such, that he's said that given enough time, the date for metallurgy in pre-Columbian America is going to, at least in Mesoamerica, is going to be pushed closer to Book of Mormon times. I mean, it used to be, the argument used to be there's no pre-Columbian metallurgy. Like that used to be the argument. Now it's, okay, there is pre-Columbian metallurgy, but it's classic and post-classic Maya. It's not pre-classic Maya. Okay, well, and they were putting it around like 1200 AD. Okay, well, now it's around 900 AD. Oh, actually, now it's around 600 AD, right?
Well,
Like
you know what the
the
argument
window
though
keeps
will
closing,
be.
in other words. Yeah.
You know what the argument will be like in maybe 50 years? Like, yeah, okay, yeah, they may have been horses and they may be like, say, metallurgy, but it wasn't Nephite horses or Nephite steel.
I mean, sure. And I mean, what do you say to that other than, okay, fine, but that's not what's being argued.
Yeah.
Is this an anachronism or not, right?
Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, he kind of mentioned like chariots because like once in the Book of Mormon, chariots are whatever you want to define chariots are, they're used in the context of horses, and horses are said to conduct them. So I think that's like an interesting text. So as I said here, chariots are mentioned in the Book of Mormon are never depicted in the context of warfare and not explicitly said to be pulled by horses. Although horses are mentioned with them, they could be something like a litter or pelican, and that's from the Mormon or website on Book of Mormon anachronisms. Now, Sorensen in his book Images of Ancient America 58 to 59, cultural preference throughout Mesoamerica called for a person of social prestige to be transported by litter. The system was sensible enough in practical terms. In whatever remote spot a group of travelers might stop, fresh carriers could be found so long as carriage depended on human muscles. Furthermore, prestige entered in. This form of transport was reserved for nobility and others of the upper social levels. To have used any other mode would have been to give up privilege and demean oneself. Privileged and sacred leaders were similarly carried on the stretch of the Old World from Eastern Mediterranean through Southeast Asia in early times. What's rather interesting, like the term chariot actually appears in the Doctrine and Covenants, but it doesn't refer to like say chariots as reaching them. Like section 2062, verse 7, August 13th, 1831. I, the Lord, am willing if any among you desire to ride upon horses or upon mules or in chariots. He shall receive the blessing if you receive it from the hand of our Lord with a thankful heart in all things. Maybe like a poetic flourish for like, say, carriages or something like that. Now, Brent Garner in his book Traditions, the Fathers, 295 to 97, discusses a Mesoamerican context for like why an animal would be like conducting them. The animal was a type of alter ego for the king. It was called the Way. The Way-ub, plural way of the classic Maya imagery, appeared in many guises, including human-like form, animals of all sorts, and grotesque combinations of human and animal bodies. And then it kind of discusses, like, say, how this is related to like divine kinship. So there's no way to know precisely what was on the plates. However, there's ample evidence that Joseph's translation process allowed him to impose modern terms and concepts in ancient but unfamiliar terms. Thus, plausible combinations of elements may explain the horse-chariot combination in the Book of Mormon in a way that fits the context and the description rather than just the assumption embodied in the English words, horses and chariot. Strengthening this hypothesis, the mention of horses and chariots in Alma 89, where the context is a great feast appointed at the land of Nephi by the father Lamoni, who was king over all the earth. The fact that the horses were fed suggests either a live accompanying animal or another instance of assumptive translation. So I know he wants to poo-poo the idea, like say chariot could be a litter, but even linguistically, like the Hebrew for chariot, actually encompasses the idea, like say some type of litter or pelican as well. And there's like a Mesoamerican context, and again, the Book of Mormon does not actually say horses are driven by chariots, only that they're conducted by them. There's a Mayan context.
The servants conduct them. That's the key point that Neil Rapley has pointed out, is that it's the servants that conduct Lamoni to his father.
Good point. Yeah,
not the horses themselves. Which, if I want to be fair, from a skeptical perspective, you might say this is kind of splitting hairs, or this is kind of reading too much into it. But I think that if we're going to parse these words and we're going to see how does this really work, then this sort of thing matters, right? And these are the guys that get mad and claim that we're the ones doing mental gymnastics or whatever. But no, this actually matters to see what the text is saying. And so if you want to get this deep into it, then you have to pay attention to these little details. It's the servants that conduct him forth, not the horses. Anyways, but yeah.
Sure. Do you want to say something else? Because like Blake Ostler just tried to call me, so I'm just going to message him. So do you want to address the idea, like say, well, people know about Bible stories, but they don't know about Book of Mormon stories. Ergo, Book of Mormon lacks any literary importance.
Oh yeah, I mean that's just kind of what would I call it? Not selection bias, but it's a certain bias that says that because something isn't as known as much as it should be, therefore it's not valid. I don't know. That was a weird point that Trent kept bringing up. The literary quality of something is independent of its popularity, right? So I'd be willing to wager that a lot of average Americans have not read like Dostoevsky or Tolstoy novels, and those are held up as some of like the greatest novels humans have ever written, right? Is like literary masterpieces. So the literary quality of a piece is independent of its popularity. Somewhere out there, there could be an unknown novel that some guy wrote that's this amazing masterpiece that nobody knows about. In fact, we have a word for that. It's an unrecognized masterpiece or whatever, right? Or to use, maybe it's not the precise analog, but I'm thinking about the music of Johann Sebastian Bach. Apparently, Bach wasn't actually very popular in his own day. It took sort of a revival of Bach's music in the late 19th and early 20th century to really get him to like be recognized like around the world as this master that he is. So yeah, I don't know what Trent's whole point was other than to say that I think the Book of Mormon's dumb because logically
Yeah.
speaking, the literary quality of a piece is independent of how widely recognized or how well it's seeped into sort of popular culture, I suppose, or popular consciousness, right? Also, the Bible has the adage of like 1800 plus years on the Book of Mormon of like circulating and people reading it and people disseminating its contents. So again, like it's kind of unfair to compare it in that regard. The fact that people have had well over a millennium with the Bible than they haven't out of the Book of Mormon. I also think personally, it just comes down to kind of just good old fashioned prejudice against the Book of Mormon. And Daniel Walker Howe, the guy that Jacob quoted, he kind of acknowledges that in that same passage that he's quoting from. He says, geez, if it weren't for the fact that it's involving like angels and gold plates and religious claims, this book would be much more widely, or should be much more widely recognized. If I recall the quote correctly, I think he makes that point. But if not, I would make that point, is to say the fact that it is tied up as a religious text also is something that we need to consider why it may not be as widely acknowledged as it perhaps should be for its literary quality. Speaking of that, it was annoying to me that Trent brought up Mark Twain as if like this pithy little joke by Mark Twain is some kind of like gotcha for the Book of Mormon. I mean, this is a tale as old as time. Anti-Mormons have been doing this ever since Mark Twain made that joke. People, Mark Twain is a humorist. It was a joke. And Mark Twain making a one-off joke about it's chloroform in print, ho ho, you know, Mark Twain is not the arbiter for what makes something good literature. He's a humorist. Yes, he's a great writer. He's a great humorist. We acknowledge that, but he's not like the final authority on what makes something good literature. So you can't just quote the Mark Twain thing and call it good because there are plenty of other people who don't agree with Mark Twain's assessment of the Book of Mormon for crying out loud. So that was kind of dumb. I mean, yes, it is funny. Haha, Book of Ether, chloroform, whatever, right? But using that the way Trent did as some kind of indictment against the Book of Mormon, I thought was pretty dumb.
Okay. I just was on the call with Blake. He's going to be joining. So in a few
well,
minutes.
That's good because
so...
I'll hop off in a few minutes then and let sort of Blake take over. I would be remiss. Can I just point one more thing out that annoyed me about Trent's thing, and then I'll bugger off and you guys can keep going. So
no, definitely. And by the way, really do appreciate you coming on, especially like after your digital thing. It's been fun, but yeah.
Okay. Trent quoted Martin Harris like 8 times when Martin Harris in his book or his little booklet, An Address to All Believers in Christ. Yeah, you've got it right there. When he says, God told me to separate myself from the Latter-day Saints. Trent quoted this like 8 times, I think. I think I counted 4 times when he quoted this. And he asked Jacob, do you think God actually said that? Once again, I would be willing to bet money that Trent has not read David Whitmer's An Address to All Believers in Christ, and he has no clue what the context is of that quote. The context is, like the Lucy Mack Smith deal, he hasn't read it, he doesn't know the context. The context is, David Whitmer is living in Missouri. He has been excommunicated. He has Danites sending threatening letters to him and threatening to inflict physical violence on him. He has to leave far west in order to escape this. I absolutely can believe God telling David Whitmer, dude, get out of town because people are going to hurt you. I can 100% believe that. I have no problem with that. And this was not a claim of God told me not to be a Mormon anymore or to leave the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints anymore. That's not what he's saying.
After he was excommunicated.
It's after he's excommunicated in the context of leave far west Missouri, where he's receiving this threatening language from the Danites and so forth. So I just had to point that out because, again, Trent Horn quoted like 8 times. It's totally out of context. It's not saying what he thinks it's saying. It's not this gotcha. And like the Lucy Mack Smith quote, I would almost be willing to wager money that it was because he just found the quote on the internet and he ran with it without knowing the proper context to it.
Well, hi, Blake. We can't see you, but like just on the Book of Mormon Witnesses, TLD order, we have an excellent page on the Mormon Or website. Anderson's book, which, let's face it, Trent has not read. It's still a must read, even 40 plus years after the fact. It should also be known, like, Trent kind of brings up, like, he brought up a few times, the statement of the 3 witnesses in the Book of Mormon was actually in the hand of Oliver Cowdery. The copy we have now is in the hand of Oliver Cowdery. According to David Whitmer, they actually seem to sign it with their own hand. But be that as it may, like, it doesn't actually matter because they always said throughout their life they did act as witnesses to the plates and so forth. So Blake's, or sorry, not Blake, Horn's argument was just like absolute nonsense. And I'll let Blake
that one
discuss
was also
whatever he
super
wants.
dumb. He brought up at least like 2 or 3 times too. Come on, man.
Yeah.
You don't know about the manuscript history. That's the printer's manuscript that Oliver Cowdery copied, and each of the witnesses independently affirmed and reaffirmed that their statement in that document was true. So again, these are such low-hanging fruit, low-effort criticisms, man. I put that up there to put it in a Catholic perspective. I put arguments like that up there next to when like Protestants or even Latter-day Saints say like, well, did you know that the Pope on his hat has the word substitute for Christ? Did you know that? That means he's the Antichrist. Did you know that the Pope has 666 on his hat? It's like, dude, stop. Like, these are such low effort, low hanging fruit arguments. It's embarrassing to use this kind of stuff.
Yeah. By the way, hi, Blake. Thanks for joining us. Before we kind of put it to you, I just want to address this in case it kind of gets lost. One of the things he brought up was like Martin Harris and Charles Anton. You know, and the impression you get, like, Harris was full of crap. You know, he was trying to save his bacon and his marriage by lying about his meeting with Charles Anton. Lester Grabb, who's an atheistic Old Testament minimalist archaeologist, and David Reich, you know, an atheist ex-LDS professor of Hebrew Bible in Brandeis, both concluded Charles Anton was full of crap. You know, I love these quotes. This is from Lester Grabb. I think we have to accept that Anton's 2 accounts were self-serving. One suspects that if the entire truth were known, there might be some embarrassing aspects for him and his professional reputation. It would not surprise me if Anton was taken in temporarily by the lines on the paper, or at least was open to their authenticity until Harris enlightened them as to their origin. And he continues. And David Reich, you know, Anton is contradictory on this matter. In the Howe letter, he denies giving a written report, but in the Kite letter, he says he gave Harris a document. In a latter letter, he says that he gave the note to Harris to warn him and to others of the fraud. But interestingly, when he recalls what he wrote, it had a much more limited scope. The import of what I wrote was, as far as I can now recollect, simply this, that the marks in the paper, i.e. the transcript, appeared to be merely an imitation of various alphabetical characters and had, in my opinion, no meaning at all connected with them. This is quite reserved, and Anton considered the matter bunk from the beginning. It may indicate that he expressed a more positive opinion before he found out about the mystical aspects of the Book of Mormon. And I think he kind of stretches a bit, but like Jerry Grover's book kind of shows what we have with the characters document, there's something to it. You know, it's not deformed English, it's not Masonic cipher. There seems to be a linguistic logic to it. Although I think like him trying to like produce a translation of the text kind of stretches a few things. But
problematic, yeah. Well, no,
yes,
that's great. I'll sign off. I see Blake's there. I've got to get running, so I'll let
Stephen,
him take over.
Before you leave, I want to clear up one thing, because he was saying that there was no such thing as Reformed Egyptian. And then he makes this banal argument about how much you could get on a plate. He had plates that were cardboard that were 3/8 of an inch or 5/8 of an inch thick, and said, you know, how much can you get on this? But in fact, there are forms of Reformed Egyptian, and you know about them. Demotic was developed about 700, 650 BC, right in time for the Book of Mormon, if you will. And it was a kind of cursive of the hieroglyphic. And it was created specifically to make it so that they could fit more into a text. The hieroglyphics were difficult because they were all you know, large symbols, but you had kind of this cursive shorthand of what the hieroglyphics were. This kind of an argument from a person like Trent was so surprising to me, because it's not merely sophomorish, it's and not merely nonsensical, it's really uneducated. is the kind of thing I would expect from a person who had no clue whatsoever about languages, no clue whatsoever about how languages can be condensed. And specifically when he has no clue at all about what the plates, were like, how thick they were, and so forth, to make this kind of argument. And his argument was literally that it was physically impossible. For that kind of an argument to be made was just the most surprising thing I think I heard out of it, because I listened at least to when Trent was arguing about the differences between Catholics and Mormons, and he sounded rather educated to me, at least when it comes to Catholic theology.
Yeah,
but this
what you
kind
will.
of
Trent knows
argument takes my
Catholicism
breath
very well.
away.
Yeah.
Yeah. It just took my breath away because it was so banally stupid. I mean, I'm not holding back here. I'm just telling you what I really think.
No, don't hold back. Trent should be ashamed of the absolute bullshit he produced during this debate.
Yeah.
And on that note, I'm out. No, just kidding. No, it was good talking with you. Yeah, we touched on that too, Blake, before you got here. His arguments about the dimensions of the plates, the weight of the plates, all that sort of stuff. But I'll let you guys take it away if you have anything else you want to add. I'll just say, reaffirm, there's more stuff forthcoming on this, more excellent research on this. And so listeners should be aware that Trent Horn does not by any means have the last word on this.
And I just wanted to bring it up because you could speak to the demonic.
Yeah, no, basically, just in a nutshell, what the Book of Mormon describes, it's true that we don't have attestation for, quote, the Reformed Egyptian that's on Book of Mormon, except for that little characters document. But what the Book of Mormon describes as happening with this script, why they are using it, their justification for using it, all of that has very real world attestation. It's all very believable. It behaves the way other languages and scripts behave historically that we have attestation for. And so what I've talked about with students and others when I teach this or when I talk about this is to say, yes, it's true we don't have samples of Reformed Egyptian that we can translate like these other scripts we have. But the way it describes it is not unbelievable, or the way that the Book of Mormon describes this phenomenon is not some crazy pie-in-the-sky thing like people pretend it is. You mentioned demotic. We could mention Meroitic is another analogous example. We could talk about what Papyrus Amherst 63 is doing down there in Elephantine, the fact they're using demotic to write Aramaic. I mean, we could go list example after example of a similar phenomenon that's attested. The only thing is we're hampered by the fact that we don't have more attestation of the specific Book of Mormon script that we're talking about here, right?
Oh, but we do have specific examples, as you put it up in Elephantine, and a script where the underlying language is in fact Hebrew, and Aramaic, the Hebrews that existed at the time, and in fact it's written with an Egyptian script. So we have a specific real life application of the underlying language of Egyptian being written in Egyptian demotic, where people are speaking Hebrew. I think that it's exactly what Joseph Smith is describing. Whether it's demotic or not, I can't say. The characters document doesn't seem to be demotic to me. But I wanted to bring it up while you were here so that we could specifically address that.
Oh, the other example that's really fun, and if I want to be snarky, I'd say, dude, why are you bagging on the Coptics? Or the Copts? Coptic is a Reformed Egyptian.
Exactly.
Greek-speaking Egyptians took the Greek alphabet and they modified it in order to write the Egyptian language at the time where Greek was the predominant language. So it's a sort of a fusion. It's the Greek alphabet with modified letters and characters to write the Egyptian language, being used by both Egyptian and Greek-speaking Egyptians of the first few centuries AD, right? Again, exactly like what we see happening in the Book of Mormon being described, modifying the script to accommodate the needs of the language being spoken, all that sort of stuff. So it's funny when people say Reformed Egyptian doesn't exist. I'm like, man, what did the Copts do to you? Or the guys down in Meroe, down in Nubia, what do they do to you? How did they hurt you that you're denying their existence or that their language works like that, right? Like, anyway, anyways, I'll let you guys go. I'm sure you can talk more about the philosophy and theology and stuff.
Thanks, Stephen. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Yeah, good to see you.
I'll catch you later, Stephen.
Yeah, cheers.
So, well, thanks again for coming on, Blake. Really do appreciate it. We haven't talked for a few weeks, but so what were your I think you watched like the debate as well, like in full or most of it. What do you think about it? What do you think about Jacob Hansen's performance? Because I know you had lunch with him, as I did back in April, to go through his opening statement. I'm not a fan of his fruit argument, but overall, I think he did a good job, all things considered. But it's like this. When it comes to Trent Horn, Trent has done very good work on the pro-life movement. I've given him publicly credit for that. He's actually a good Catholic apologist. I think some of his arguments are stretched, but like he interacts with the best historic and modern critics of Catholicism. But excuse the language, but like his arguments when it comes to Mormonism has always been and will continue to be bullshit. I'm sorry, but there's no other way to describe it. It's crap. And he didn't do any homework. He didn't do any meaningful research except Nahum's only 3 letters, and Mulek, he doesn't know what a hyperchristic form of a name is and stuff like that. It just drove me crazy. He claims to have read some of your stuff. He's told me before he's read my stuff on my blog. I doubt it now, but what do you think of the overall assessment? How do you think Jacob did? How do you think Trent did? And
yeah, my overall assessment is that Jacob brought up some very good points. That I was disappointed because the questions seemed to focus not on the Book of Mormon, which was what they were actually talking about. They really wanted to, as most of these discussions turn into a let's crap on Joseph Smith kind of a discussion. And it's exactly what he did. The kinds of things he was bringing up are banal. They're the kind of things that I expect to come from a person who's not well informed about Mormonism. Frankly, any ex-Mormon who has even a passing knowledge of Mormonism would have done better than Trent addressing the kinds of issues, because it's clear that he doesn't have any in-depth knowledge regarding the subject matter.
I agree. Someone like Dan Vogel would have done a much better job. And I
agree with that.
Critical of Dan. Yeah.
Yeah. And I thought Jacob did a good job responding off of the cuff to some of these kinds of attacks. But the discussion has to be a bit nuanced, and I don't think a debate is a very good format actually for addressing most of these issues. I mean, how do you address the issue of the way that ancient manuscripts actually worked with what Jacob brought up as intertextuality? And I thought it was good to bring it up. But it takes some discussion of intertextuality, description of intertextuality, and how translations with intertextual interplay actually work in order to get the feel for what the Book of Mormon is actually doing, which is a very complex work, by the way. And I agree with you. I thought his Fruit's argument was not very good. We're good people, so we have what we say has to be true. And Trent did a good job, I think, exposing the fallacy in that kind of an argument.
To be fair, I did tell Jacob Hansen in advance, I don't think you should use that argument because it could come back to bite you. And unfortunately it did. But overall, I still think like Jacob did much better than Trent did. Because like it was basically a Gish Gallop. It's like polygamy, Book of Abraham. It was basically like most of it was basically everything but the Book of Mormon. And what came out from Trent for the Book of Mormon kind of reveals he has no friggin' clue. I mean, yeah.
Well, and I agree with you. His off the Trent's, toe deep into the water kind of address of the name Mulek and the kind of address of what we're dealing with at Nahum. The kind of combination of elements at Nahum I find to be at least very suggestive and requiring an explanation as to how the text would have come up with so many hits. I don't think it's proof by any stretch, but I think that it's very suggestive and requires some kind of at least consideration. And he's dead on that Mulek is a name that was discovered as the son of King Zedekiah. We now know that when Joseph Smith's day, nobody did. And the kind of discussion where he was bringing up the Kinderhook plates and the Book of Abraham. And look, here's my primary. I'm an attorney, and I know that when you define the issue and you define the format, you define who gets the upper hand and who wins. Okay. And setting it up so that Jacob had the burden of proof against somebody who could just sit back and gish glop all day long, which is what he did, is an unfair kind of a setup. And so Jacob had the card stacked against him, and when Trent couldn't respond or actually come up with any kind of an argument, it's, well, you're the one who has the burden of proof and you haven't done it, which is really
he kind of brought that up because like he kind of follows Stan Vogan saying maybe Joseph actually did have a set of fraudulent plates. And so when Jacob asked him, where in the historical record do we actually have any evidence of this? It's like, it was basically, trust me, bro. Well, it was bad.
No, Jacob did a good point pointing out, look, you've been convinced that he had plates by the very same witnesses that you're saying you don't otherwise believe that they saw an angel. And the kind of thing that he was trying to do to say, oh, well, it was either just this kind of, these spiritual fanatics who were having an experience, which is really, I think, what Trent was arguing, shows a complete failure to have read and understand what the witnesses have actually said in their lifetime. And his treatment, oh my gosh, of saying, well, we only have it in Oliver Cowdery's handwriting, he doesn't understand, and you've already discussed this, that you're doing with the printer's copy to go to the printer, and so it was all written by Oliver Cowdery because he's the scribe, and his comparing it to the New Testament. And look, I'm very open about this. If all I had were the evidence in the New Testament, I very likely would not believe in the resurrection, because it's not very strong evidence, in my opinion. The short ending in Mark, with no resurrection appearance at all, the two different, very, very different appearances in Matthew and Luke, that, there are a number of very critical facts they can't get together on. And then the very, very completely different story that's told in the Gospel of John would indicate to me that I have something like a growing tradition here that is being embellished as they go. And Paul doesn't have anything like a resurrection experience. He doesn't know if Jesus is appearing in the spirit or in the body. He doesn't feel him. He doesn't touch him. It's nothing like a resurrection appearance that the 12 were talking about. So saying, and Luke, we know that Luke was Paul's companion. I'm not sure how much we know about the authorship of the Gospel of Luke. Trent seems to be very, very certain about that. I'm certainly not. And he seems to be very certain. I mean, you've got this statement, for instance, in 1 Corinthians 15, that Paul, he was seen by Cephas, and then he was seen, by the other apostles, and then he was seen by 500 people. Well, if there were 500 people who saw the resurrected Christ at once, it would have been something that they made a great big deal of, and we would have had names. That, in that part of the account, I've never found believable. I don't think it happened. And the part of the account in Matthew where he says, and many resurrected people appeared, that also is, it's a lone statement. It's something that I don't think many people put stock in. So if all I had were the Gospels, I don't think I would be very persuaded. I am persuaded because of the Book of Mormon and because of the restoration. And for Grant to compare the immediate, within a week kind of testimony, handwritten, affirmed in affidavits, as they assert, a book published with, and remember, Oliver Cowdery writes a letter about his testimony of an experience with the angel even before the Book of Mormon is actually published, in response to a question. And so we have pre-publication confirmation from Oliver Cowdery, and then the book is published with their testimony in it. There were, how many original copies were there in the first printing of the Book of Mormon that went out, with their testimony in it? And everywhere they go, they're the focus of attention. And to say that, we're not even sure if they asserted this kind of a thing. I'm sorry, that's so scholarly irresponsible. It is so off the charts nonsensical that it's hard for me to take Trent seriously after listening to this kind of a response. I mean that very seriously.
Yeah, and he used very late third-hand sources about Martin Harris seeing Jesus in the form of a deer. No primary source. I mean, the guy has 3 earned master's degrees. He should at the very least know what a primary source is, its import, and what a friggin' third-hand late source is, and all this kind of jazz. And he brings up the spiritual eye stuff. Neil Rapperly and Smoot have done an excellent job. In fact, most recent issue, and it's available for free online, they actually have an excellent takedown of the Burnett letter as well, and a host of other things as well.
I think it's very clear Burnett's making things up to justify his position.
It's also third hand,
Yeah, so. It's hearsay within hearsay. It's not reliable at all. What we have from the witnesses is firsthand personal information on a personal experience. We don't get anything remotely like that with the resurrection, and to claim that we have anything like that is just absurd. I'm sorry, to make that kind of comparison indicates to me that he's not taking the evidence seriously. All he's doing is spouting a position he thinks he can defend in a debate.
Yeah, and two quick things. My friend, who's actually a Bickernite member of the Church of Jesus Christ, although they accept Book of Mormon, Josh Gailey, has done a very good job. Sure, if you accept the minimum facts theory for the resurrection, ipso facto, it transposes perfectly to the Book of Mormon, the witnesses, and the existence of plates. So shout out to my friend Josh Gailey, who's done excellent work on that. But also when it comes to, say, David Whitmer, one of the 3 witnesses who never came back to the LDS Church, he went out of his way to always affirm the physical reality of the place, the physical reality of the angel. It's in his book, An Address to All Believers in Christ, that Horn raised from 1887. The second half of the book is a diatribe against Brigham. Cindy Rigdon ruined everything. Joseph was a fallen prophet. Changes in the revelations. However, the first half of the book is gold plates is true, Book of Mormon's true. I saw the witnesses. It was physical, tangible. And the next year, the year of his death, when he knew he was dying, he made sure his graves, his tomb, which is still extant, actually had his testimony engraven upon it. And as you know, he went out of his way to correct misunderstandings. It's like, do you want to address like how he completely misunderstands a newspaper account and David Whitmer and
It
stuff like that?
shows it shows how little research he'd actually done. He didn't even understand that the account that he was reading from a newspaper was the very account that David Whitmer responded to. And Jacob pointed this out. It's like, hold it. That's the very account that David Whitmer said, called into question and said, what they're saying I said is not true. And then you've got Trent saying, well, all he's saying is that his testimony is true. He's not denying it was just spiritualized. And it's like, no, dude, read what he actually said. You're not paying attention, or you're misrepresenting your familiarity with the evidence here. So I was very disappointed in Trent with respect to that kind of an exchange. And I don't think, well, how do I say this? I'm going to say that Trent was doing the best he could with the kind of surfacey sources that he undoubtedly spent the last 2 weeks reading on the internet. Okay. But that's what it appeared to me.
He basically got all of it from Jimmy Akin, who's also a Gish Galloper. But it was pretty bad. So he said like he's read your stuff, and do you think he's actually familiar with your Throne Theophany stuff? And maybe this might be a good way like for you to like give an overview of your work on Throne Theophany and how it does make sense if it's a 19th century text, because I know you've done very good work on this.
I appreciate it. I have no way of knowing whether he's familiar with it or not. He gave no indication that he was. Jacob brought up that, there are ancient prophetic forms in the Book of Mormon. Trent didn't address it. Jacob didn't bring it back up. So there's no way for me to assess whether it was something he was familiar with or not. I think that there are three kinds of Hebraic forms that demonstrate that the Book of Mormon has an ancient core. The first kind is the Throne Theophany and prophetic call that we find in 1 Nephi 1. I mean, right in the very beginning of the Book of Mormon. There was an ancient call narrative that was very formulaic because it was necessary and used by the prophets in Israel to establish their credentials as a legitimate prophet of God. And 1 Nephi 1 is a perfect example. I have an article, by the way, you can find everything I'm going to mention at blakeostler.com. Okay. So they're all there. You can go and download these things. This was published in BYU Studies. But the form of the prophetic call and Throne Theophany has been written about extensively. It's very well recognized, and it's very clearly present in 1 Nephi 1. There's a second type of prophetic form. I mean, I talk with ministers, and one of the first things I do when I start a discussion is, can you explain for me the elements of either the prophetic call or the prophetic lawsuit? In Hebrew, the rib, the divine rib. And they have no clue what I'm talking about. I say, well, what are the chances that a backwoodsman who was writing 150 years before any scholar ever addressed this knew all of those elements and you don't? Okay. There's a form for the way that Hebrews brought lawsuits. You have to remember they didn't have paper to write on. And they didn't sit down and write a complaint and say, well, these are the things that were done, and here's the code in Leviticus that they violated. It's not how they did it. The judges would sit at the city gate. The people would go to the city gate, and they would basically scream out their lawsuit. And we find in the Bible half a dozen times at least where God himself is the plaintiff, where he's bringing a lawsuit against Israel. Others we find where there are lawsuits that are brought by litigants. And so the form of the prophetic lawsuit is fairly well established. It appears 3 times in the Book of Mormon. The other type of form is a covenant renewal form. There's been an immense amount of work done on this with various Hittite and Assyrian treaties, and really wasn't recognized until scholars were dealing with the Hittite and Assyrian materials. But there's a specific form for the treaties that are entered and for establishing and renewing a covenant with the king or a subservient treaty with the king. And there are a number of different forms of this, but there are some very basic elements of this format. They're very well recognized. They've been discussed since Mendenhall at some length. And so we're talking about the early, mid 20th century. And the prophetic renewal form appears at least 3 times, probably 4 in the Book of Mormon. So I'm talking about Mosiah 2 through 6, Mosiah 7, Mosiah 25, and when Christ comes in Second Nephi, or in Third Nephi, 11 through about 20, we have a fourth, but it's a very extended covenant renewal. But Christ is the giver of the covenant. He's renewing the covenant with the new law in Third Nephi. So we have these very well established forms that have only been recognized by scholars since they had access to ancient Near Eastern forms, and had this kind of study, and that they would appear as completely and consistently as they do. I think if anybody sits down and compares what's happening, for instance, in Mosiah 2 through 6 and Mosiah 7, they're going to see the kinds of similarities that I'm talking about that fit perfectly the covenant renewal form. And to assume that Joseph Smith could just come up with these forms because he had a Hebrew Bible at his elbow, it's just the kind of thing people come up with every day. How come it doesn't appear in any other work before the 1950s? It doesn't. I've done extensive study to try to see if it appears anywhere, and I can't find any instances of these forms being used. Joseph Smith just happened off the cuff, as he's stream of consciousness dictating, come up with these and put them into the proper context at the proper time with the proper person delivering the multi-element form to establish exactly what is necessary for an ancient Hebrew document. So that's the kind of study that I'm looking at. There are a number of other items I could mention. I think the use of the Egyptian names Pianke, Pahoran, Pakumenai in the appropriate context, these are genuine Egyptian names. They have a meaning, and in the context that they're used in the Book of Mormon, that Egyptian meaning is actually reflected. These are not biblical names, but he can come up with them. Those kind of things are strongly persuasive to me of an ancient core. I've written an article called "The Book of Mormon as an Expansion of an Ancient Document," where, because we don't have anything but an English text. An English text, by the way, written in 17th century King James English, that quotes extensively from the New Testament, long before the New Testament was written. And so we have to have a theory that reconciles what is very persuasive evidence of antiquity with what is obvious evidence of anachronisms and texts that didn't exist at the time. And so we have to have a theory of translation that will give us a full picture. And remember what an adequate theory is. An adequate theory is the one that best explains all of the evidence, the most parsimoniously explains all of the evidence, not just the evidence you want to pay attention to, like Trent was doing. And so my book, The Book of Mormon as an Expansion of an Ancient Document, is my best shot at giving a theory that does just that. So I guess that's what you were asking.
No, that's good. Yeah. Any other thing you want to raise that was brought up during the debate that you think may not have been covered adequately or covered at all? Because, again, there's a lot of guilt galloping. He brought up the Kinderhook plates. See the work of Don Bradley on this. We discussed it on the Mormon Ore website for the B.H. Roberts Foundation as well. But it was basically I did tell Jacob in advance. He'd bring up Book of Abraham, he'd bring up plural marriage, he'd bring up basically everything except the real issues. And I was proven right. Which is really unfortunate, but because I have some respect for Trent, but whatever respect I have now is really gone. But anything you want to bring up that you don't think was addressed?
I suppose I think it's legitimate to say the person who provided this document to us is a known forger, so you can't take him seriously, which I think is analogous to the kind of argument that Trent was making, but he didn't have the background to understand the historical issues that he's actually dealing with. I mean, he probably did the best he could, and I'd like to give a ton of grace to people who are doing the best they can to understand a different religious tradition. And so I'm going to give Trent the benefit of the doubt and say that he was operating in good faith and not just trying to bring up these things to throw what he could at the wall to see what would stick.
Not to contradict you, Blake, but he did write a booklet 9 years ago. He has been addressing Mormonism for a bit now. It's not say he's new to this field, so I don't. But maybe that's just you're a much nicer person than I am.
Well, that's not true, by the way. I'm an attorney, you forget. And so that just can't be true. So I'm
Irish, so I'll raise you that.
I've listened to a few things that Trent has done. He seems to me to be operating in good faith. I very often disagree with him about the strength of the kinds of evidence that he thinks establishes Christianity. I mean, we could throw out the kinds of things that, Andrew Sullivan did an expose of the Vatican and how it's a cesspool of older priests who are exploiting younger priests for sexual favors, that kind of a thing. And that's the kind of thing that Trent was doing with Mormons. What does it really show? I mean, yeah, there are really bad people, I think, in every religious tradition. I will say that I think that the recent scandal in the Catholic Church has had a major impact on the willingness of people to take religion, organized religion, seriously. I think that it accounts in large part for the move away from organized religion that we're seeing. There are other things that are involved as well, but I think that kind of thing is a major impact. That said, I have a ton of respect for Catholics and Catholic theologians, even when I disagree with them on almost everything, because I actually think they're bright people operating and doing the best that they can. His consistent attempts to say, well, and maybe he does it because he's offended by it. Well, you're calling my church the great and abominable, and so there are Mormons who have done that. What I detect is that he's offended by that kind of a thing. He's saying, I love this church, and you're saying I belong to the great and abominable church. And admittedly, in the first editions, before he got in trouble for it, Bruce McConkie, in fact, did just that. But he got in trouble for it. They wouldn't let him continue to make that claim. And so, somebody said you belong to the great and abominable church, and Trent came really close to saying that in what he said today. Mormons are just Muslims in drag, I think was what he was saying. You're not really Christians, you're fake wannabes. But let me say this, we can't be true Christians, he says, because we don't accept the proper view of God. But I think if I press him on it, he's going to say that when it comes right down to it, God is a mystery. And so what we have to affirm in order to be saved, according to him, is assert that God is X, where X has absolutely no meaning whatsoever. So unless I can assert that I believe something I can't understand in any manner whatsoever, and I assert an empty placeholder as the basis of my faith, I can't be Christian. And if that's what Christianity is, I really want no part of it. That's nonsense, not faith. On the other hand, I have a great and deep abiding respect for Thomas Aquinas, even though the most telling, and the apostasy is the other thing that came up. And perhaps that is, I got the sense that he was offended by the notion that there's been an apostasy. And I think Jacob is correct. I mean, they both agree that the apostolic authority no longer existed on the earth after the first generation. He doesn't seem to be bothered by that, even though it's obvious from the New Testament that the apostles attempted to continue the college of the apostles, or the quorum of the apostles, by bringing others to make up the number 12 as best they could. But I think that there's something even more telling about the apostasy, and that is, if there's no revelation, if there is no actual communication from God to a human being that describes his will and what God is actually saying, then how could they have anything like an ex cathedra, that is an infallible communication? If that's not revelation, what the heck could establish that? I mean, it seems to me that they have no basis whatsoever of making the assertion that kind of ex cathedra kind of a statement could actually be made by a pope. And let me add, I think that, for me at least, one of the strongest indicators of the apostasy is that by the mid second century, instead of going to the scriptures to say, look, we get our understanding of God from revelation, as he has disclosed himself to us, they're running to Greek philosophy to fill in the holes to understand what God is. And more often than not is to say we can't understand God at all, because what they're actually describing is the God of Greek Neo or Middle Platonism. And later, when Aristotle's discovered, they run to Aristotle instead of to the Bible for a description. If you can show me anywhere in the Bible where it says that God is pure act, that anywhere in the Bible where they have a notion of timelessness and simplicity and divine simplicity, anything like that whatsoever.
And it's not just divine simplicity for the Romanist, it's absolute divine simplicity.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, divine simplicity is a very, very complicated and complex doctrine, okay, ironically. But to suggest that that can be found, and what's the basis for their coming up with it? It's not revelation, and it's not some kind of inspiration. It's sheer Aristotelian philosophy for a God who's just not available for religious purposes, so that there's a God who can't have any relation to anything because nothing can possibly affect him in any way. So what we're running into is he's saying you can't be right because you don't have the right view of God. And the most look, I've heard a lot of stupid arguments in my life, but to say because the Catholic Church is true, where I get to beg the question and I get to simply say, well, it could be that there's some things that are true in Catholicism and other things false, and the Book of Mormon is still true. Could be true that there are some things true in Mormonism and other things false, and the Book of Mormon is still true. So the way he was making the argument, it's both a non sequitur, an ill-formed argument, and simply one that begs the question.
Well, here's the thing: the LDS Church could be false, but one of the other restoration groups could be true. So, by the way, because he begged the question, like Rome is true, ergo Book of Mormon is false. If Trent wants to, I will happily debate him on a de fide dogma. That's supposedly apostolic, and that's the Immaculate Conception. I will even go to Steubenville. Matt Frack can even be the moderator, and the thesis is the Immaculate Conception of Mary as defined by Roman Catholicism and apostolic tradition. 20-minute openings, 10-minute rebuttals, we can even go longer, and cross-ex each and concluding statements. I think it's fair to say I'm the LDS apologist who's done the most work on Mariology. Yeah, it's like, well, if Rome's a true church, this dogma, which was defined in 1854, which is supposedly apostolic in origin, it can be defended. So that's test Rome's claims. And if the claim is, well, I'm not going to debate Mariology with someone with different presuppositions. This is a historical claim. Rome claims this is the historical faith. The deposit of faith stopped being added to. So we should find the substance of the teaching in the earlier strata, like the New Testament and the post-apostolic traditions as well.
And I think there ought to be a debate on whether prayers to saints and prayers to Mary are in fact consistent with only worshiping one deity, whether they're consistent at all with Christianity, and when that kind of a practice actually began, and whether or not what they're doing is, they use the word veneration. It's a distinction without a difference. Or whether they're praying to intermediaries to ask them to mediate on their behalf to get to God. I mean, however you take Catholic doctrine, there ought to be a debate on whether or not that's appropriate for Christians, given the biblical restrictions.
What's worse for the Catholic, though, is like, it's not just prayers to saints is one, like icon veneration is another, because that was defined as, at the Second Council of Nicaea 787. And basically the response, like, Horn and Aiken produced against Gavin Ortland, who's a Calvinist. He's a very amicable, ecumenical Calvinist, unlike most other Calvinists. But basically their response was like, well, just as there was a shift from like abiding by the law of Moses to not abiding by the law of Moses doing the Acts of the Apostles, the church, can actually do a 180 when it comes to the propriety of like venerating icons. Here's the thing. According to Rome, public revelation stopped being added to with the death of the last apostle. You can't claim like revelation does a 180 now. And also, this is a de fide dogma. Apparently, it's apostolic in origin. So basically, it's basically like stabbing Newman on it. And I mean, we got on with history, but we have the Pope, so it's okay. We're still a true church. I'm sorry. At least like Eastern Orthodox apologists, theologians will say, no, it has to go back to the apostles. That's what the Second Council of Nicaea taught. And even the 25th session of Trent in December 1563 taught as well against the reformers. So again, there is the allowance for like doctrinal development in traditional Catholicism, but like these modern Roman apologists want to like put it on steroids, even beyond what Newman himself intended in 1845.
Very, very clear. Well, I'd be willing to discuss with him whether or not Thomism is coherent and whether or not it can be squared with any kind of coherent Christology, and whether or not Catholics can actually have a coherent Christology given their rejection that humans can't be the same kind of thing as divinity.
Yeah, because like if Christ is actus purus, how could, this is why like Aquinas and also Augustine did not believe like the manifestations in the Old Testament are actually the second person of the Trinity. It was actually created angelic avatars. But the biblical account clearly presents them as like the angel of the Lord, or the second person of the Godhead.
He's the angel of Yahweh. Or I mean, there are a lot of different ways of looking at it. And for those interested, I have an entire book on the Godhead and the Trinity of God and gods, and I have a book on the concept of God and whether or not there can be a coherent Christology, the attributes of God. Well, you're good. Oh, well, okay.
I expect to check for advertising in the post in the next day or two.
Not until you put volume 4 up there with them.
That one's back in Ireland.
Gotcha.
But yeah, so like Trent, if you listen to this, and hopefully you will, you have 2 debate challenges from both of us. I'll have to debate you on Mariology, specifically the Immaculate Conception, and if it's apostolic. And I'll even grant you original sin is true for the sake of the debate. So we don't even have to bother with that. I'll have to concede that point for the sake of debate. So we can debate whether it's apostolic in origin. And I'll even fly to Ohio, Steubenville on my own dime for that. No,
You'd be happy to debate him or any Calvinist on whether or not original sin is true in the way they conceive it.
Sure. Yeah. But yeah, any other thing you want to bring up? Like, overall, like, as I think we kind of both agree, like Jacob, for someone who's, and I don't mean this in any bad way, for someone who's not formally trained in the fields, he did a good job. What do you think was his strongest? What do you think was his strongest point? What do you think his weakest point? And also, like, one of the topics we have not discussed so far with ourselves and also Smoot is like polygamy itself. So maybe we can also address like what's your thoughts on polygamy. So strengths and weaknesses of Jacob's point, and maybe like we can get your thoughts on say Fanny Alliger. By the way, Don Bradley has done excellent work on Fanny Alliger recently, and I really doubt Franti's aware of this. But yeah, I'll let you take it as long as you want.
Well, I thought that Jacob, we've already discussed the faux pas with respect to the we're really good people, so the church is true kind of an argument. But I thought he did a really decent job, by the way, of explaining the Book of Mormon, intertextuality, how that works, and challenging Trent, especially on the comparison between the witness's testimony and why he would accept the New Testament testimony about the resurrection. Because I think that's the one thing where Trent looked foolish for not conceding. Yeah, you have strong evidences there, and it would make a person who is reasonable want to consider, actually looking into it to see if it holds up upon further consideration and inspection. I think that with respect to polygamy, I don't like this kind of gish galloping kind of attack that happens. Oh, well, what about polygamy? He's a bad person because he believed. Jacob did a good job making a distinction between marriages and sealings, because what happened is Trent saying, well, Joseph Smith is a dishonest person because he didn't tell Emma. The fact is he did tell Emma. He didn't tell Emma about the sealings. He told Emma about the marriages. And we know that he told her because she was there at the ceremony, placing his hand on the hands of the other women that were there when there was actually marriage that was taking place that was more than just a sealing. With respect to Fanny Alliger, I think and I agree with you that the find that Bradley brought, our attention was essentially Eliza Snow's comments that she was with the Smiths at the same time that Fanny Alliger was, which means that the events took place long after most of the historians have talked about the Fanny Alliger incident. I've actually written a paper because I'm quite certain that what occurred is that Emma Smith saw a sealing ceremony taking place with Fanny Alliger. Joseph Smith thought that it was appropriate to be sealed to her. He was her guardian, and she saw through the slats in a barn. We know that there was a ceremony that took place for Messiah Hancock, and that's what she saw. She became upset. Joseph thought that Oliver Cowdery would understand because just a few months before, Oliver Cowdery was in the Kirtland Temple with him, seeing Jesus Christ, Moses, Elijah, Elias. And so he knew that Oliver Cowdery was there when the sealing power was received. And I think he thought that Oliver Cowdery would understand what had occurred. So I think that what happened is that Joseph Smith called in Oliver Cowdery to try to help to explain to Emma what was occurring. But Oliver Cowdery didn't get it. He didn't get the distinction even that existed between a sealing and an eternal marriage. And so, frankly, she became very upset. There's no question that she forced Fanny Alliger out of the house. And it bears noting, and I think that Jacob brought this up, the DNA evidence is now conclusive that the only person with whom Joseph Smith had any offspring was Emma, which would, you can come up with all kinds of ad hoc explanations without any evidence for how that could occur, but the best explanation is the obvious one, and that's that he wasn't having sexual relations. My view with the Partridge sisters and the Lawrence sisters is that Emma was there. She was there during the ceremony, consented to it. And then before they could consummate, she drove them out of the house. This happened twice, by the way. And so my take on Joseph Smith's plural marriage is that whenever it involved an actual marriage where conjugal relations would be involved, he did tell Emma before anything took place, and then she lost it because she just couldn't bear it. Nobody's blaming Emma that she changed her mind. I mean, that's understandable. But and I want to say this, the Doctrine and Covenants 132 is like a Leviticus document that is case law. It brings up and says, if this is the case, these are the rules that apply. There are several different cases that it addresses, but the only case in which it addresses conjugal relations is when there's a first wife, an individual wants to marry a virgin, and the first wife consents. And so Joseph Smith is actually following what's required in D&C 132 when conjugal relations are involved. And so what I want to, I mean, I've kind of written all of this up, and maybe someday I'll actually publish that. But that's how I assess Joseph Smith's polygamy. I don't think that he was dishonest with them. I just don't think he felt that he needed to tell him all about sealings, which probably she wouldn't understand anyway at that time. And obviously Oliver Cowdery didn't understand. But, and let me say this, Oliver Cowdery never would have agreed that Joseph Smith admitted that never admitted to committing adultery if he believed that Joseph Smith had actually married or had conjugal relations with her, because he never accepted plural marriage, ever. He was always against plural marriage, even when he returned to the church. And if he believed that that's what had occurred, he never, first of all, he accepted that Joseph Smith never admitted that he had, that he committed adultery, which is Oliver Cowdery agreeing to something like this. Yes, Joseph, you were sealed to Fanny, but I don't agree with that. I think that's not acceptable, and I'm not going to accept it. And however, I think he kind of came around, because when he returned to the church after Joseph Smith's death, he, after bearing his testimony of the Book of Mormon, he then went to David Whitmer's house and attempted to convince David Whitmer to return to the church as well. Unfortunately, he died before he really got a chance to persuade David. But the bottom line, I think, is the best evidence, and I'm an attorney, so I see it in terms of what's really happening. How are these people actually interacting with each other? And it appears to me that Oliver Cowdery simply rejected the notion that Joseph Smith could be sealed to a young woman, even if it didn't involve conjugal relations. So that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, and I think like the research over the last number of years by Brian Hills and Dalton Bradley, e.g. the 3-volume Joseph Smith's polygamy, has kind of shown this is the case. It's like, but like Trent, if you read his works and his articles, he's really dependent upon Todd Compton. Whether or not he's actually read Compton's book cover to cover, I don't know. But he's dependent upon Todd Compton's 1997 book, In Circuit Loneliness. But and with all due respect to Todd, I've actually talked to him in person before. He's a nice guy, and he's done some interesting work. Is like anything in the last 20 years, well, before like say 2010, basically has been dated, especially because of Don Bradley's research and tracking down documents. But yeah,
on the Hell's research as well, I think has been fairly significant,
especially in polyandry.
Yeah, exactly. So the one would have to explain why it is that Joseph Smith is clearly being sealed to a number of women with whom it's clear he never had any kind of conjugal relations. If that's the purpose of what he's doing, then why even that group of women? And so there's a lot to simply say that Joseph Smith was a sex hound obviously doesn't begin to explain the evidence whatsoever.
No, and like as Donald Bradley has shown, like by looking at the chronology very carefully on Nauvoo, the first 2 or 3 women he took as plural wives, which were just Sealands anyway, in Nauvoo, they were all heavily pregnant. It wasn't about getting laid. There was something more theologically going on.
Oftentimes it was it wasn't always the case, but oftentimes it was a husband consented, or a husband had left the church and the wife wanted to be sealed to Joseph Smith. I mean, there's more going on, and each case would have to be taken on its own merits, I think, to fully explain what's going on. But it's not the simple Joseph Smith was a sex hound, and so he came up with plural marriage. That's an explanation that doesn't even remotely begin to explain what was actually happening with the historical evidence.
Yeah. And again, whether or not he may have heard of Brian Hales, he may have heard of Don Bradley. Heck, Christopher Smith, who's kind of an atheist, former Pentecostal critic of the church, who wrote a very interesting paper with Don Bradley recently in the recent Signature Books book on plural marriage. Probably has never read it. And it's like, again, Jacob did well for someone I'm kind of blessed to work professionally in this field. You've done a lot of work on this since you were about 14,
Exactly.
And you've been, it's like, I mean it's like Jacob is a good debater. He's a smart guy, especially for someone who, again, this is not meant to be a shot. I actually am personal friends with him, who does not actually have professional expertise in the relevant areas. For an amateur, he's very good. But Trent is meant to be a professional Catholic apologist. He has 3 master's degrees. You would expect on paper it would have been an absolute evisceration, especially on home territory.
Yeah, and it clearly was not.
No, I mean, I think any unbiased, I'm biased, you're biased, but trying to be as unbiased as possible, I would say easily, at the very least, 6-4 in terms of Jacob's favor, if not 7-3, if you analyze things.
Well, I think who the winner is, it's like a presidential debate. It kind of depends on what your prior biases are as to who you will see as the winner. I can see all the faults because I'm so familiar with the data. I can see all the faults in both arguments. And I was most disappointed in Trent because of the kind of, not only was it surface trash, it was nonsense. And the kinds of things he was bringing up were strongly indicative of the fact that he hadn't read the sources. He really didn't know the background. He didn't understand them. And he was just bringing it up because he got it from some anti-Mormon website or from some, anti-Mormon screed that he had read, because he hasn't dealt with the documents. It's very clear to me.
Yeah, the best quote-unquote research he did seem to have read Wonderly's Hit and Miss book, an imperfect book that came out a decade ago.
For him to say that Wonderly is an expert about Lamanite origins or chiasmus. All things chiasmus. I mean, Wonderly is he's an attorney to begin with, so he's a rotten guy to begin with. You'd have to begin with that understanding. The second thing is Wonderly doesn't have a clue about Hebrew structure, Hebrew poetry, or chiasmus. And to say that he's the expert just because he got it into an article that was published by Dialogue, since the time that it's been on the verge of being an anti-Mormon rag, honestly.
By the way, I can't speak about this while we're live streaming, but after we end the stream, I have to tell you something about Dialogue. But yeah.
Okay. In any event, I was disappointed in Trent because I expected far better. I was surprised by Jacob because I think he did far better than I expected. And those were my expectations for him, how I thought things were going. So
yeah, and when it comes to chiasmus, there was a very good article that was published a couple of years ago by BYU Studies on say the complexity and intentionality of chiasmus, and also maybe Wonderly, he's quoting from his book as mostly the article in Dialogue, but presenting from that, the leading scholar on chiasmus happens to be Jack Welch, and he's not seen as a kook. In fact, even non-LDS have acknowledged, when it comes to, say, the Book of Mormon, there doesn't be at least some instances of intentional chiastic structures. Not simply say parallelisms, but intentional chiasms. And,
there are a number of instances in the Book of Mormon where only intentionality could possibly explain the text. I mean, honestly, it's very clearly intentional what's going on. There are chiasms in Alma 34, 36, 2 Nephi 9. They're so clearly intentional that anybody who would argue to the contrary, I don't think has really dealt with the evidence. But the mere fact that you have an intentional, chiasmus was known in the 19th century. It appears purely not remotely developed like it is in the Book of Mormon, but there's some chiasms in the Doctrine and Covenants.
Yeah.
And so, they're not well-formed chasms, and they're certainly not the kind of extended chasms like we find in the Book of Mormon, but they're there. And so the argument that if chasmus is present, it's proof certain that this has to be ancient, I don't think you can make that kind of argument. I think you can
I
say
agree.
this is indicative of an ancient origin and strongly supports the
Yeah.
claims that are made. And I think it was well beyond Joseph Smith. I mean,
Yeah.
that's
By the way, for what it's worth, I actually would agree with you. Like, as much as I like him, I think Jeff Lindsay thinks, I think he kind of goes beyond the pale when he says, like, chiasmus single-handedly proves the Book of Mormon can't be 19th century. But there, as you know, like, there is like many instances of like lengthy intentional chiastic structures in the text, sometimes even better than the biblical text in the original languages. So from my view, and I think we are on the same level, is like it adds to the verisimilitude of the Book of Mormon. It is consistent with like it being a translation of an ancient text, and it shows a very high level of complexity to the authorship of the volume. It's also important like as an exegetical device.
Yeah, and it's not only that, but the parallel elements seem to be based upon natural Hebrew word pairs, the kind of things that actually form parallelisms in Hebrew poetry and Hebrew thought.
Exactly.
And
like
so,
in like Helaman 6, there's like a chiastic structure. Jacques Welch has discussed this, where the pivot point or this turning point is like Zedekiah and Lord. And if you know Hebrew, Zedekiah, the IAH is like Yah or Yahoo, and Lord, of course, is Yahweh as well. So the turning point only makes sense in like, say, of a Semitic influenced text, so it's really like subtle but really convincing stuff.
Well, and it wasn't brought up, but you get the same thing with the name Gazellum, which is essentially discloses robbers. That's a name. And Gazellum is disclosing the existence of bands of robbers in the Book of Mormon. It's a genuine Hebrew word. It functions perfectly, but it's a wordplay that's possible only if you're really familiar with Hebrew. So there are those kind of things that exist in the text. And to say Joseph Smith just comes up with these, with one hit after another. I don't buy it, but obviously I've already accepted Joseph Smith as a prophet. And so I tend to see things, I think, that wouldn't be persuasive evidence to those who don't accept that.
Yeah, I agree, because like, and we're going to be largely in agreement here. Like, ultimately, at the end of the day, you can nuance things, but like, it's either a 19th century text or it's a 19th century translation of an ancient text.
Right.
And so, and like back in July, I gave an institute lesson on like, say, Book of Mormon evidences, largely on the old word, because that's my forte as an anthropologist and someone trained in some of the languages. You will like, there is going to be like translators anachronisms. That's inevitable, because it's in English, for crying out loud. But at the same time, like, there's so much evidence that only makes sense if it's a translation text at the same time. I just don't find like a lot of the theories out there to be persuasive. Like you had like we go ahead.
Inadequate theory has to take that into consideration. It's fairly persuasive evidence, I think. And I just don't see, the theory that Joseph Smith just came up off, with it off the top of his head, or he memorized it and used the key words as a basis for the rest of the text. It leaves so much unexplained. It's ridiculous. But it's the kind of thing I think fits into a holistic theory that says, how do we best explain all of the evidence here? And at least that's how I approach. It's how I approach everything, because I'm an attorney, and it's like I want to come up with a way of approaching the evidence that makes sense of it and that people can actually buy, and that I, in presenting it in my integrity, say this is what I actually believe the evidence indicates. So that is, I think, where the evidence leads with the Book of Mormon. And it's unfortunate that we got so much gish galloping by Trent. I think he's better than that, actually. I mean, I'm going to give him the benefit. You might not have that kind of faith in him, but I actually believe he's better than that. But the kind of surfacey sources he was using lead me to doubt that he has any grasp whatsoever on actual Mormon documents and history. So,
well, he hasn't improved in the 9 years since his book that came out. I'll say that. It's like last year, Pints of Aquinas wanted me to debate Jimmy Aiken on the reliability of LDS scripture. And I said I would agree to that, but like we would have to have a more specific topic. Because like a few years previously, I challenged Jimmy Aiken to debate the Book of Abraham. He wanted to do the entirety of LDS scripture because he thought he could like throw out all his arguments in a against the entirety of the LDS canon in no opening statement, that's a freaking gish gallop. And it's unfortunate, like, he's following his mentor, Jimmy Aiken, and being a gish galloper. It's unbecoming, because Jacob could have easily done a gish gallop as well if he wanted to, but he didn't.
Oh, and like I said, when you've got the burden of proof, you can't do that because you've got something you've actually got to show. And I think he showed at least these things. He can. It's beyond contestation that Joseph Smith actually had some sort of plates that made metallic rattle sounds and had something written on them. Even the critics who reject the Book of Mormon outright accept that because the evidence is so compelling. The very same evidence that indicates that they actually had spiritual experiences where they saw angels in connection with the text, and God declared that it was a correctly translated book. The reality is that these kinds of witnesses, those witnesses who later lose faith in the person that they want to support, they're actually against them, are the strongest kinds of witnesses that you can find. If I could find somebody who hated my client and I could get them to tell my client's side of the story, that was always very convincing to a jury, because those kinds of witnesses have to be believed, because they're not going to say that unless they just feel absolutely bound by their own integrity and honesty to do so. And that's what we find with the Book of Mormon witnesses. And I think Jacob drove that home well.
Yeah, he did a very good job. And again, I know I recommended the book earlier with Smoot, but Richard Lloyd Anderson's Investigating the Book of Mormon Witnesses from 1981 is a must read. And also Smoot and Neil Rappley has a recent article. It's actually online for free, investigating the Burnett letter in the most recent issue of Religious Educator. Right. And like last year in the Fed script for Daniel Pearson, and if anyone wants a copy, email me. I'll happily make a PDF for you. Neil Rappley addresses the spiritual eyes.
I've read it. It's very clear that Burnett is simply grinding an axe, and his hearsay within hearsay kinds of assertions are simply not going to withstand scrutiny. So even though we have some historical source making these kinds of claims, they're simply not believable.
Yeah, and as I said, like any historian would label it as third hand. It's not a primary source, unlike, say, an address to all believers in Christ, where again, Whitmer has like a chip on his shoulder against Joseph Smith. He thinks he's a fallen prophet. He thinks the Brighamites are going to hell in a handbasket. Sidney Rigdon ruined everything, but yeah, Book of Mormon's true, and I saw the plates, so like deal with that.
Trust me, if he had any doubt at all, if he had any reason at all to doubt what he experienced, he would have simply come out and said, "Look, I followed Joseph Smith. I got bamboozled. We made it all up." That's certainly what would have occurred, and that's not what occurred. His testimony is rock solid, and his experience of the angel and of the plates is rock solid. I'm surprised, however, that no one made the comparison with visions of Mary. We see Mary far away in the sky and that kind of things. To try to compare them to the Book of Mormon and say, well, if you're going to believe that, you've got to believe this too. But he did do that, by the way, with the string, with string. And so he's saying, well, there are these other guys who came up with plates. And it's like, yeah, but they didn't produce anything. String came up with the Book of Commandments, which is, if you read it, it's like, are you kidding me?
Yeah, it's even more boring than View of the Hebrews, but yeah, and like even these witnesses went against him, and the text and so forth. So again, like there's a parallel. There's plates, but there's so much he's not telling you about Strang and these witnesses. But by the way, guess who actually raised the Fatima? Well, the witnesses, quote unquote, like Marian apparitions against the witnesses recently?
Did that?
Rob Bowman.
Oh my gosh. Well,
Rob Bowman is the same person who said in his book, maybe there were plates and maybe they had etchings, but the witnesses were not trained in linguistics or ancient metallurgy, so their testimonies of limited value.
Yeah, and when they saw the angel and God declared it to them, they were on drugs, right?
But no, I might as well bring this up. Like, how would you respond? Like, say, well, you have your witnesses, but we have like lords, we have Medjugorje. Well, some question Medjugorje, but like Fatima. Like, do you think that there's any meaningful parallel between like the Whitmer et al. And say witnesses to the approved Marian apparitions?
Yeah. Well, the ones that have actually been accepted as miracles, you mean, by the Catholic See?
Yeah. So that's not address Medjugorje, because I know some trad cats who think it's satanic, but so.
No, I don't. I actually, when I was on my mission at Italy, I actually cross-examined a woman who claimed to have had such a vision. And after I asked a few questions, it was pretty clear that she had she really didn't see anything at all but clouds. So, but she was one of those who would claim that she had seen Mary, but a few questions exposed that very quickly. And that's the other thing. These witnesses were cross-examined, and they were examined in numerous interviews. They were cross-examined by people who were skeptical. They were allowed to ask really deep questions. So now their testimony withstands scrutiny. And Interpreter has a couple of films coming out, right? A couple of audiovisual presentations that deal with the witnesses.
Yeah, they actually had a documentary / movie like 2 years ago or 3 years ago.
Yeah.
So yeah.
They've got
work on the stuff.
They've got a sequel coming out, is my understanding.
It's on the succession crisis.
Oh, that's right. You got me. You're right. It's on the succession crisis. So in any event, and one last thing, bringing up Von Brody and the views of the Hebrews just off the cuff like he did. I mean,
Smoot and I were discussing it, and it's pretty clear he probably has never read View of the Hebrews, but yeah.
If he has, he should be ashamed of himself. So all I'm saying is bringing it up the way he did indicated to me he had no clue what he was talking about. So that enough said.
Yeah, and again, like there's an article / primary research project on the Mormon Or website that kind of goes through View of the Hebrews. You also learn a lot about Ethan Smith, who was like seemingly like a really cool guy. He was like, he's an abolitionist and stuff like that. So he was really based for the time, but most boring book I've ever read. But like there's an entire chapter of like purported Hebrew Aramaic words amongst the Amerindians, so it's not something like tucked away in a footnote. It's like in its entire chapter that goes on for ages. Not a single word appears in the Book of Mormon.
Right. Well, and in my article about the Book of Mormon as an ancient source that's been expanded, I address the views of the Hebrews and the proposed parallels, and they don't exist. I mean, they're contrived. So, unless you're really going to stretch the parallel to try to, in an engagement of parallel mania, the parallels mean nothing, and really bad form for trying to bring that up. I'm still going to give him the benefit of the doubt. I want to believe that he's doing the best he can. It's hard to fully grasp. There's a lot in Mormonism and in Mormon history to really master. And I have a hard time getting upset at somebody because they haven't fully mastered the massive amount of documentary evidence and evidence that one would have to in order to have that kind of conversation.
Yeah, for instance, like it doesn't seem like he's familiar with, say, Matthew Bowen's excellent work, not just on the etymology of Book of Mormon words and names, but the word place in the Egyptian and Hebrew. Like J.E. Scott, like Jacob did bring up like one of my favorites, like Gershon, land, place of inheritance. There's others like Moshiach, and that's not simply like meshing together Moses and Isaiah. There's like, and we kind of discuss this with Smoot, like there's an intentional wordplay throughout the entire book of Mosiah based on Hebrew Moshiach as like a deliverer, savior, often in non-violent means. There's the Gazalem one that you've raised, stone, shining stone in Hebrew, like in Lamentations and so forth. There's so much. It's like, Trent, if you want to be, it's like this. I'll tag him on this video. Trent, you want to be taken seriously by Informed Latter-day Saints, you will actually do a better job next time. You did like mention like a year or two ago on Pints with Aquinas, you might want to write a book on Mormonism beyond your booklet from 2015. Dude, you have to spend a couple of years researching. You're a smart guy, but you're better than this. And if you want to be taken seriously by myself and Blake, you have to up the ante. If this was the type of stuff I produce in Catholicism, I should be absolutely ashamed of myself. It's Jack Schick-esque.
Yeah. And I think I know Aquinas and Thomistic literature and discussions pretty well, so I'm willing to take that on with him.
Yeah, in fact, you've read the Summa Theologia and Summa Contra Gentiles in Latin.
Right.
So, and it's like you disagree with Aquinas, but like we actually had this conversation a couple of weeks ago. Like, clearly you know Aquinas very well. As read myself, you've actually read a lot of Garrigou. Lagrange is probably considered like the best 20th century Thomist.
Lagrange is probably the best. Yeah.
So, I can vouch. I can vouch for you and you've written your books. Trent wants to debate a Davy